All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we are doing a Shroud-related show with my guest, Teddi Pappas. So, hi, Teddy. How are
How are
you?
you? Hey, how are you doing, Dale?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
doing
I'm
pretty
doing
good.
pretty good.
Mute
Mute
yourself.
yourself.
Just
Just
to
well.
the
With the
all right. So yeah. Basically, today's plan of action is we're. I focus a lot with fan requests on responding to bad faith skeptics and people that aren't necessarily trying to give the truth. Today, we're going to switch things up and go for a good faith skeptic, a shroud skeptic named J. Warner Wallace, who's a famous Christian apologist. He's on our side and that sort of thing. He's famous for arguing cold case Christianity. And he's actually come out with a recent video talking about the Shroud of Turin. And he has come out on the side of Shroud skepticism. So I was asked to reach out and kind of do a response on that front. But I felt it would be appropriate to bring on board Teddy because he's a criminal detective and a homicide detective. So he's used to presenting this case from a courtroom perspective. And who better to kind of respond to that than a courtroom defense attorney with Teddy there. So, um, yeah, Teddy. Okay, so I'll just get from you before we play. What's your general take on J. Warner Wallace? Were you familiar with him and his
and
work
his work
before?
before. Yes, absolutely, and I've admired his work very much so, and so I was very disappointed to hear what his conclusion was. I seem to recall he said that he did acknowledge the complexities involved with Shroud scholarship and all the many evidences involved, and it sounds like he was encouraged by people. To weigh in on this. But I don't think um, everybody that first starts learning things, they'll learn some things and they'll think that they've then got a good handle on it. But usually that's, as we know, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more involved, and it takes many years of very intense learning and scholarship to really start to get a handle on the many complexities involved with shroud matters. So, um, I'm hoping that maybe we can move the needle. He said 60-40, so not just 11%, but I want to see if maybe with some of the information that we'll be bringing up today, maybe we can get him to where I'm at, which is at a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. I don't think one can reasonably doubt that the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Christ if one is really aware of all of the details in the plethora of evidence. So we'll see. He definitely seemed to have an open mind and to be open to reassessing, new information or different ideas. So, um, he's a cold case detective. So I, I would think that he's going to be very interested in getting down to the bottom of things, and if there's new information to look at it. So I think we have an honest broker in Detective Wallace, and so let's see. But we're going to just kind of bring up some things for his consideration, as well as the huge audience that he has, who um, who have just heard him, in his position as a cold case detective, somebody who obviously is big on the details. Um, Weighing in against the shroud's authenticity. So we want to both reach Detective Wallace as well as his audience and other people too.
All right, just mute yourself. Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. So yeah, I think what I want to do is start first. Just want to play his conclusion. It's just a 3-minute clip, and then I'm going to follow that up with the first main point. It's something that you've talked about before, but Yeah. So first things first, let me just play a clip here of his conclusion, followed by what I think. Yeah, and then we'll discuss his first point. All right. So that's popping up. So yep. So this you can see David Russell and David Paulman. They interviewed J. Warner Wallace, so we are definitely fans of his work and that sort of thing, and appreciated what he's had to offer. But here's a 3 minute clip of what Jay Warner says in terms of his own take on the Shroud of Turin.
So I just leave it out. I'm benign about it. Do I think this? I think I'm more inclined 60-40 that it's not authentic. But I'm still open if we had more testing, if we had and I don't think we ever will get that. Because to be honest, I don't think it's authentic. And I think that the best thing you do if it's not authentic is to kind of resist long-term exposure of this to any other testing. So I think in the end, I would say this. I don't think it's legitimate, but it is not something that we should be dividing over. And that's where I see right now, we're in a world where everyone is either radically to one side of an issue or radically to the other. So the question is, are you willing to divide over this? The New Testament's really clear. It never encourages us to put our faith in relics. Our faith is in the person of Jesus. Our faith is in what the apostolic eyewitnesses said about him, his death, resurrection, and ascension. It's about the strength of that eyewitness record, period. That's it. We should not divide over this kind of stuff.
All right. So that's his conclusion there. As he said, he's 60-40 on the Shroud, so he thinks that the evidence is quite weak. And therefore, he says, look, we shouldn't include this in our set of evidence. Just kind of leave it to the side. If somebody brings it up to you, maybe then you could speak about it. But yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, what's your general take? Let's assume his assessment is correct just for the sake of argument. Do you think it would be appropriate if to leave out the Shroud kind of thing if it's a weakly evidenced thing, or do you think there could be value in bringing it up regardless?
Well, first of all, he said 60-40. That's not him considering the Shroud evidence weak. And from listening to the evidences that he brought up, he was grappling with the issue of image formation. So I disagree, Dale, with your assessment that he was thinking that it was weak. 60-40, that's almost a tie. It's pretty close. It doesn't take much to move someone to over 50%, which would be in court, what we would call a preponderance of the evidence. So that's not going to take much. And
Okay.
I have confidence that with things that we're going to bring up, I'm hoping that we can move him at least above the 50% mark. But really that, the evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt. It really is. And now he said that he felt that there was a need for more testing. There really isn't. With the information that we currently have, it's more than enough to get you to the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, even with the radiocarbon dating. We'll get into that later. He said to not put our faith in relics, but Jesus performed miracles in order to show people evidence of who he is, of his divinity. And so Jesus is the one that set the standard for Christianity being evidence-based. Nobody in the Bible just said, I'm not going to show you anything and you just believe what I say, because if that's the case, then we will fall prey to every single false person claiming to be, divine, or a false prophet. I mean, so Jesus doesn't want us to fall prey to whoever's going to be the next shiny Messiah, or the next shiny person claiming that they're God. He wanted to give us evidence. And let's not forget, Jesus made repeatedly falsifiable claims saying that he was going to be scourged, mocked, and killed, and that on the third day he'd rise again. And again, Jesus was performing miracles. He was showing people. He showed Thomas when Thomas was doubting. Jesus gave us the evidence and gives us the evidence in the form of the shroud, and what the shroud's message is in terms of affirming his resurrection, which affirms that Jesus is a truth teller, and which then means he's divine. So yeah, I don't think we need more evidence. I think we've got plenty. Did I answer your question? Or was there something else in the question? What was?
Yes, you did answer my question there. Just so people know, we have an echo issues. That's why we're taking turns muting each other there. But yeah, I think you answered my question, and it was an interesting answer. So, from your perspective, if you can just push J. Warner Wallace over that line, that 50% threshold, that's good enough for a belief, is what you're saying. And I like you mentioned. I think what is the first issue he raises between the 4 to 5 minute mark is that he says, well, look, even if I grant everything about the shroud, it can prove that, okay, Jesus died and he was crucified, but it doesn't, he says, it doesn't get you a resurrection. And that's the opposite of what you just said. So that's the first issue I want to ask you about is how do we get to the resurrection? Pretend he grants all the evidence. How do we argue for a resurrection and not just a crucifixion? And I'll unmute you now. Oh, you're muted. Just unmute yourself.
Gotcha. All right. So actually, when I was listening to him, he was talking about how the images on the shroud are evidencing a crucified man, but he did acknowledge that there's a hint of the resurrection to it. And by hint, obviously, he means the image formation process, because what else could it be? It's the inexplicable images, and we don't know how it was produced. So he was acknowledging that, yeah, there's something. But now I'm going to say that I believe there's far more than a hint of the resurrection. And God, being an all-knowing God, knew that if he there's evidence of rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm in the body images of the shroud. I've written a paper on it, and we can link to it. Now, some people will say, aha, you see, the shroud is evidence of a dead man, not a resurrected man. Not so fast. Not so fast. God wanted us to have evidence that Jesus was in fact dead. Why? Because the Muslims and others claim, oh, he didn't really die on the cross. Swoon theory. He didn't die on the cross. Hugh Ferry has argued that he didn't die on the cross. So God, in his great wisdom and knowing all things and seeing all things, he gave us evidence of death in the form of rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm. So people say, well, but how is that evidence of the resurrection? Now, the way I see things is, we know that for a human being, or for any living creature, to be alive, energy is what gives us life. And of course, in Leviticus, blood is what gives us life. But you also need that energy, right? When a person is dead, the energy is gone from their body. To resurrect somebody, there needs to be a reinfusion of energy into their body. So when Jesus was resurrected, the energy comes into his body. And that energy is what created artificial aging for cellulosic yellowing, which is what the images are from what Heller and Adler chemically shown beyond a reasonable doubt. It's cellulosic aging. And we can get into that some more in a second. Don't let me forget to get into that more. But so this burst of energy caused rapid, artificial, accelerated aging of the linen to create the straw yellow image. And through this, but that's at the moment, the millisecond, maybe even smaller than a millisecond of the resurrection. Now, think of cause and effect and reaction time. Does anybody think that a body that is in rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm is going to, the precise moment that energy is infused into the body, does somebody really think that at that same precise moment the rigor mortis is going to be undone? No, there's going to be a little bit, it may be a split second or even milliseconds later that there's the reaction time, but there is that reaction time. And so what the evidence of the resurrection is the energy that forms the image on the cloth. So we are given in that cloth evidence of a dead man and evidence of a man that has just been resurrected. So that's how I'd answer that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I would also use an appeal to things like the rigor mortis first to establish that he is dead. And then I would also include things like, in terms of the resurrection, I say that the shroud implies the resurrection because, number one, we know that the body was somehow, in a way suggesting a miracle, was miraculously removed from the shroud within a period of a few days because before sufficient decomposition liquids formed on the shroud. And the body somehow was removed from that in a way that suggests a miracle was taking place. So I think when you just reflect on that, what's the best explanation for that? That implies resurrection, right? Given the context of who the person is and how he died and everything like that. And within a few days, you've done studies. You mentioned your rigor mortis and cadaverastic spasm studies that suggest, sort of a maximum time frame when the body would have had to have left, and that's consistent with the Gospels. So, yeah, that's how I would handle that. Is that it explicitly proves that he died in exactly the unique way Jesus died in the Gospels, and there's this strong implication that, well, okay, number one, we can prove that the body had to be removed within a few days in a way that suggests a miracle took place. What could that possibly be? Resurrection. You know what I mean? So that's how I argue it, if that makes sense. But all right. So with that said, I'm going to move on because this next argument, it's twofold, and we'll start with the first part. But he spent a lot of time. I've heard you discuss this issue of chain of custody when we're talking about the historical authenticity of the shroud. And he's a homicide detective, so he also talks about this thing of the chain of custody. And the first issue he starts with is he kind of begs the question. He says, our first historical document is this Darcy memorandum. So let me just play that clip of what Wallace said, and then we can address first starting with the Darcy memorandum, and then the issue of a lack of chain of custody. All right. Is that showing up?
And it's mattered historically. But what's interesting about this particular artifact, when the first writings show up in the mid-1350s, right around within 30 years or so, around 1389, A bishop of Troyes named, I'm sure I'm going to kill his name here, Pierre de Arcas. He sends a memorandum. He sends a writing to Pope Clement the Seventh, and he's already at this point in history, 1389. So remember, it starts off in the mid 1350s. By 1389, you've got a bishop who is saying, "Hey, this cloth is just here's a quote cunningly painted unquote forgery," and in fact, he actually argued, this Pierre de Arcas, argued that the artist had already confessed to this. And when writing to Clement VII, de Arcas complains that the Dina Lire, who was positing this as a true relic, that he was, quote, consumed with avarice, unquote, and that the entire purpose of this created artifact, this created relic, was to, in fact, draw the pilgrims and all the money they would bring with them. And it was all about the gain of money, the goal of gaining money. And it was not about devotion. It was not about that it was true. It's that he saw the financial value in having the relic. So this.
Okay. So as you can see, this first part here, Teddy, is it's important for two reasons. So number one, he says this is direct evidence that the shroud, it only goes back as far as the 14th century. We have an account from an eyewitness as to the origin in the 1350s. And the second thing he says is this also establishes the motive, which is important in a court of law, right? That why were they motivated to fake it? For power and money. So what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, the Darcy memo is hearsay upon hearsay. So that's no good. Second of all, he uses the translation, and I forget what the Latin word was, because this was a somewhat impromptu video in terms of our deciding to do this. I didn't get a chance to go through everything I would have if we'd had a bunch of time to do this, but I think you and I both felt we needed to get a response out. But my point is, people can go look this up. You can go read the Darcy memo, and also it's important to read it in its original Latin. The word, and I don't remember what the word is, but the word that has been translated as cunningly, that's not the only translation for that word, just like most words don't have a single translation. But the word cunningly implies, a forger trying to trick people and all that. And of course, Detective Wallace jumps from there to, and that's why he came up with some fancy special way to trick everybody, with some fancy way to create this image so people would be in awe of it and all that and think it was legit. But cunning is not the only definition for that Latin word. There's a far more benign definition. I don't remember what it was, but trust me, or don't trust me. Go get the Darcy memo, just Google it. Get the Latin, find where they're talking and compare it to the English translation. Look for the precise word for cunningly painted. And also the word painted is not the only term. I mean, here I'll muddy things up a little bit, but it still doesn't matter because anyway, we got the goods. My point is that there, for the word painted, I think the word in Latin is something like depingere. I'm sure I'm slaughtering the pronunciation. I think it's depingere, something like that. It can mean to paint, but it also has other meanings. I think perhaps like to represent or something like that. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because I'm going to bring up another Latin legal phrase, which is my favorite, especially with regard to the Holy Shroud, and that is res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. Nobody, I mean, David Roth put out a was it like $1 million, £1 million reward for anybody that could recreate the image formation process with tools that a medieval artist would have had. And hey, who cares? Let them people try it even with current thing, as Hugh Ferry and Colin Berry have attempted with modern day methods, and with the Hugh and Colin Berry have had the advantage of a ton of knowledge of studies done on the shroud, to where they could try to create a process through reverse engineering all of the specifications they know, and they still can't come even close. And you know what the funniest thing is? It's so elegant in its simplicity. Probably one of the biggest flaws, even with the bas relief process, is the reality that nobody is going to be able to clean a roughly 14 by almost 4 foot long and wide cloth and 2 full-size body images of an adult male, and clean that so well from any type of paint, pigment, stain, or dye that would be responsible for creating the image formation, the image, and clean it so well to where there are not going to be trace elements of the paint, pigment, stain, or dye. And we know it can't be a scorch mark, because scorch marks fluoresce under UV light, and the body images on the shroud, the frontal and dorsal body images, do not fluoresce. So, it can't be done. There's going to be evidence of artifice, and that's what there's. I mean, when Hugh Ferry did his experiments, he was doing just a very small, little bitty linen cloth, where he did it on a small bas relief of like some fruits and stuff, and some fruit, and he was intentionally scrubbing with a toothbrush, and really, really trying to get all that pigment out. And still, with that little bitty thing, he couldn't get it clean enough. And he was trying his best to get rid of all evidence. And he couldn't do it on that. And so somebody's going to do it on 2 full-size body images. I'm telling you, that takes a bigger miracle, and with no context to properly support it.
Okay, and image formation, I am coming to that, because he does say some specific things, so I want us to cover that in detail. But just for now, since you do raise it up, so let me deal with this first. So before I give my take on the Darcy memorandum, J. Warner Wallace at another point, he does mention the uniqueness. He admits the uniqueness of the images and how they're formed, but he just says, well, this would be totally expected, because this medieval artistic genius was trying to do something unique. Of course, it's not a painting. He appeals to the cunningly painted thing that you addressed, Teddy, but he says he was trying to come up with a novel and unique method for creating these images, and that's why it's totally unique. So he says this is this is totally to be expected, and I just wanted to respond to that, because it seems like J. Warner Wallace has an anachronological perspective on this. Look, and even the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, on this show, on videotape, has said, look, this is not the way it worked. Back in the medieval times, artists weren't the crazy mad scientists trying to come up with unique things. No, they were professionals who would be hired by a church or by a king or something and commissioned to create a specific thing. They couldn't just experiment and create anything they wanted to. In this period of time, they would be commissioned to produce something very specific. And that's why Hugh Ferry tries to go for the quem queritas hypothesis and say, well, it was commissioned by a church for it to be this quem queritas ritual. Of course, there are no images with those cloths or anything like that. But I just wanted to mention that it's totally historically inaccurate to think of this medieval artist as some kind of mad genius working in his lab, inventing different techniques to come up with unique images that have never been made before. No, he would just be, look, I've got a job to do. You hire me to make some images. Cool. I'll paint up images, whatever you want, like that. So I just wanted to see if you wanted to respond to that before I come back and give my take on the Darcy memo.
Yeah, let's kind of bring in Occam's razor here. Let's not look for, zebras when it's horses. But no, somebody's going to say, well, the resurrection, that's the biggest, exotic creature imaginable. Well, no, it really isn't. It really isn't, because the evidence and the historical evidence, we bring in the darkness at crucifixion, a supernatural event, bookending the crucifixion. We have the darkness that nobody can explain because it's a miracle. We can get into that later on too. But also the shroud that nobody can explain. I mean, we are given enough to understand what it is, meaning that it's a miracle, and meeting David Hume's definition of a miracle. Yep, we do that. We absolutely do that. And because it is more reasonable to believe in a miracle based on the miracles that Jesus performed. And, we have Josephus talking about this. We have, in the Mishnah and the Talmud where there's reference to Jesus. But in the Gospels, we know that the Jews were not denying that Jesus was performing supernatural acts. They just thought that his power was from Satan. So even they, his biggest enemies, the ones that sought to have him crucified and that did, they thought he had this power. They just were just unfortunately, tragically, didn't realize that it was from above and not from below. But so getting back to Occam's razor, we know that when you look at all of the evidence, Jesus making falsifiable claims, and then we have the evidence in the form of the shroud, it is reasonable, it is logical, it is evidence-based to think that the shroud's body image was formed from what I call, which makes sense, resurrection energy. What's not reasonable, totally not reasonable, it's cuckoo to think that some artist is going to come up with some method to create this image with its many, many special features and qualities when he didn't need to do that. His audience, the people looking at it, had no idea there's evidence of rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm. Nobody's looking at the shroud. First of all, they've probably just taken a quick glance at the shroud. Using Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, and even the Stirp team, when they went in there, they were figuring, they were prepared to find that it was a painting. That's why they did so much work ahead of time to figure out all of these different tests to test for paint, pigment, stain, and dye, because they went in with the presumption that it's probably a painting, but what if it's not? Let's take a look. So, and I've done watercolor painting. I've done all sorts of artwork, oil painting, watercolor, pastels. I can tell you, with what you see on the shroud, why wouldn't someone do precisely what old Walter McCrone had his artist friend Walter, I forget his name at the moment, but he was a well-known artist back in Chicago back in the day, back when all of this was going on in '78. And he he commissioned and he taught his artist friend ways to try to replicate the shroud, and teaching and even telling him, okay, try to do this, try to do that to approximate the image, and they still failed. And but that's what you would do. You would go with the simplest method. Who in the world, if I want to create something simple, I can't think of anything right now, but if I just want to create something simple, am I going to, a tent? Am I going to come up with all sorts of crazy ideas how to do a tent, or if I'm just going to do something straightforward?
But
it would be a watercolor painting.
So I'll just mute you for a second. The point I was trying to make, though, was the historical implausibility of what Wallace is saying. And even Shroud skeptics like Hugh Ferry have commented on this show about this, that it's totally implausible to picture the mad medieval artist working by himself in his laboratory, cooking up these methods. That's just not historically what happened. These were professionals who got hired or commissioned by somebody who told them what to do, what they wanted, and stuff like that. So the model itself just doesn't even work from a historical perspective. That was the point I was trying to make.
I mean, yeah, I agree with you, but look, I'm playing devil's advocate. I'd still say, well, who knows? Maybe there's just some, kook that wanted to do something like that. The point is why? Where's the motive to add in features that nobody is even aware of? That makes no sense. That's what's illogical. That somebody would add a bunch of features. I mean, think about with the scourge marks. You see these two round things that are obviously the plumbata, the lead balls that were put sometimes on flagrums, on scourges. And by the way, there's no evidence that it was dumbbell shaped. That's what people are hypothesizing, but a lot of people are saying that it was dumbbell shaped. We don't have a historical scourge that meets what a lot of people are showing as a scourge. There's one in the British Museum, but that one does not have a dumbbell shape. It just has round balls. But anyway, I digress. But the point is that you see these two spheres or round shapes on the shroud where the scourge marks are. But then, especially under UV light, you can see these scratch marks, which you don't really notice in the regular light. So why, I still can't figure out how, what kind of a weapon creates, how did those click? I don't know. It's still a mystery. Who knows? Yeah. Why would somebody put in those details?
Let me step in, because to your point, I do think that's a great point about the lack of motive, right? Because again, he speaks to, it's power and finance, but there is no motive to come up with these specific type of features. First of all, they couldn't conceive of them, and that sort of thing, right? And to begin with, but even if they could, there would be no motive. And this is a point. Look, you're a lawyer. I'm a philosopher, so I can picture maybe J. Warner Wallace saying, puff, you guys don't know what you're talking about. But I'm going to play a famous clip from an actual medieval art historian saying exactly this. And I always play this clip because Dr. Thomas de Westlow. This isn't some biased Christian. This is an agnostic who specializes in medieval art history. And he's saying this precisely with respect to the total lack of precedent and the total lack of motivation to make such unique images. So let me just share that for the audience. All right.
On the 13th and 14th century, like the picture you see on the right. Now, if the shroud is a medieval image, dating from around this period, art historians like me ought to be able to look at it and study it and tell you who painted it, how they painted it, where it was painted, and so on. But we can't. And the reason is that it's not like any medieval image. Here's one obvious problem. The image you see on the left is the image on the shroud. This is the cloth image. I'm just showing the facial area. Now, it's a very sort of mysterious mask, but it contains an extraordinary secret. Because when you photograph it, and this was done for the first time at the end of the 19th century, you discover that tonally reversed, that odd mask, which is all people would have seen in the Middle Ages, it contains this extraordinary, astonishingly realistic, positive image. It's amazingly realistic, like a photo. Now, this would have been completely beyond anyone painting in the 14th century. I show you on the right, this wonderful painting by Simone Martini. It's an artist I've studied. And it shows you how people were painting the face of Christ in the 14th century. Now, it's very obviously stylized. You can see the brush strokes, you can see the outlines. Unlike the shroud image, which is basically just like a modern photo. Now, here's a second reason why that image on the shroud can't be a medieval image. No one in the Middle Ages knew about negative images. No one knew about negative images until the discovery of photography in the 19th century. And no one in the Middle Ages would have wasted their time, even if they could have done, producing an image like you see on the left that you could only appreciate if you photographed it, and then you could see the true quality of the image, the amazing figure in the middle. So, in my view, it just doesn't make sense as a medieval image. There's another reason as well, and that's that the image is vanishingly faint. It's so faint that if you get closer than about 6 feet away,
I can skip this, I will. Sorry about this.
This is my 100th fire!
melts into the cloth. You can't actually see it. So no one could have produced an image they couldn't even see that when they were making it. From an art historian's point of view, there's another reason to doubt that this could be a medieval work of art. If you wanted to fake a holy shroud in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to create a forgery so brilliant that scholars like me and scientists working in the 21st century would be fooled by it. All you needed to do was to paint one. And what I've got on the right of the screen there is the Holy Shroud of Besançon. It's actually an accurate copy of it because it was destroyed in the French Revolution. Now, this was very obviously just a medieval painting. You can see how stylized it is. But until it was destroyed, this shroud was thought to be an authentic relic of Christ's burial. This image was thought to be a miraculous imprint. So you didn't need to forge the perfect forgery in the Middle Ages. People were gullible in those days, especially when it came to religious relics.
All right. So I think you guys kind of get the point there. Sort of back, Thomas de Westlow again, medieval art historian, a non-religious agnostic, backing up what Teddy was saying about the lack of motive there. And in terms of the Darcy memo, just before I return it to you, Teddy, if you have any last things to say on this topic before we move on to the image of Edessa, because he speaks about that. So in terms of the Darcy memo, I agree with a lot of the problems that Teddy mentions. And J. Warner Wallace, he does mention that there is another associated document here, right? So pro-Shroud guys, they'll mention there are various problems with the Darcy memorandum. Number one, it was never sent, very probably never sent. It's not signed and dated, for example. There's no evidence for it in the Vatican archives, so we have no proof that anyone other than Bishop Darcy and his scribe ever saw this thing to begin with. But beyond that, we have scientific reasons falsifying this. That a medieval artwork could even explain this. And again, we'll talk more on that when we get to the image formation section proper. But even from a historical standpoint, we have other documents. So I noticed Wallace mentions one document that the skeptics always go to, right? Like Hugh Ferry, that where it talks about the anti-pope Clement VII in 1390 said that you have to call this cloth not a fake, but just call it a representation. And they use that as proof. See that everybody knew this was just a fake artwork, and the art. Obviously, Bishop Darcy was correct because he had this inquiry into it where the artist confessed about 34 years earlier. But I always find it funny because the skeptics, first of all, in terms of this document, their interpretation is wrong. It doesn't say it's a fake. He's just saying call it a representation. And what is Clement's motives for saying that? And in order to find that, we have this interesting evidence because we have two other letters dated before the letter the skeptics cite and one afterwards where the Pope is clearly changing his mind, right? So the most up-to-date letter we have is June 1st, 1390, 6 months after the papal bull that tells Leary to call it a figure or representation. Guess what? The Pope's changed his mind. He has no restrictions, and he says, go ahead, keep displaying the cloth and making money from it. This is not a problem at all. And there's no mention of idolatry anymore, unlike the earlier letter. And he gives his full blessings. And he strictly prohibits anyone of whatever rank from appropriating or usurping the offerings of the faithful who go to see the shroud on pilgrimage. So why is the Pope changing his mind? If I was J. Warner Wallace, I would be asking, okay, well, why is he switching? If he had absolute proof that it was a fake from an inquiry, I would expect him to be consistent. But the Pope's not. He's waffling back and forth. And that suggests perhaps there's another reason for his opinion going on, such as the one Jack Marquardt might suggest, for example, with his simony hypothesis. Another thing that doesn't get mentioned a lot is this. We have a letter from Bishop Henry dating back to May 28, 1356. This is the guy who supposedly held the inquiry that Darcy is talking about in 1389. He doesn't mention anything about an inquest at all. No record of an inquest. No record of an artist confessing that he had cunningly painted the shroud at all. And instead, and this is 3 months right before Geoffrey de Charny I dies, all Bishop Henry says is, you guys are doing great. I praise, ratify, and affirm the divine cult you guys have of showing the Shroud of Turin and Leary. You get 2 thumbs up from me is essentially what he's saying there. So it's just interesting that, yeah, the evidence completely falls on its face when you actually look into the external documents and ask questions about those documents, which Wallace doesn't do. He just does it for the Darcy Memorandum and says, well, that makes perfect sense. It gives you the motive of power and money as the motive. But yeah, Teddy, I'll give you the last word on this topic, and then we can move on to the image of Edessa.
All right. So what you mentioned in terms of, well, why did the Pope change his mind? Well, it was the Pope's uncle, what was his name? Iman de Genevieve or something like that, who was married to Geoffrey de Charny's widow, Jean de Vergy, who had this shroud. And so this is purely speculation, but I think there's a good reason to think that either the Pope ended up getting the opportunity to actually see the shroud, or he had it on good authority from Jean de Vergy that, it's legit, and or maybe from his uncle Iman. So Um, I think that those are quite possible explanations for why he changed his mind, or perhaps he changed his mind because he felt that he initially, by trying to limit how it was shown, maybe he felt he made a bad decision and then felt guilty about it, and then became emboldened to do the right thing. So that's a possibility.
So Teddy, we actually have a very interesting question in the audience that you as a lawyer might know about. So James from 21st Century Apologetics is saying, I've not seen Wallace's presentation, but if he's framing this as a court case, how does he meet all 5 elements of fraud? And who's the plaintiff or victim? Do you know what he's talking about in terms of the 5 elements of fraud? Is that a legal test or something?
I can't think of 5 elements of
Sorry,
off the top of my head. I'd have to look at, each state is going to have their own criteria in their state statutes in terms of what needs to be proven. But in terms of,
Sorry, you were muted during your first part. So can you what did you say at first in answer there? You're unmute yourself.
Okay, there we go. How much of what I said did you hear?
You came in mid. You didn't hear the beginning of our answer.
Okay, I was saying, to prove fraud, it depends on a state's particular statute and what the criteria are that they're setting forth for fraud. But you're going to initially need to have somebody where there's the motive to perpetrate a fraud on someone else, and that they're gaining some sort of benefit, and or that somebody else is going to get some sort of a detriment. These are just general aspects of fraud. Again, it depends on a particular state's statute. In terms of the people who are being victimized, the victim in this case would be the public, either in believing something that is not true and or giving money to a church when they go with their pilgrimages and maybe make some offerings. Wallace made a big deal about, the money that comes in. It's like, well, come on now. Every church needs money to run. You tell me, a priest or a pastor or a parish or whatever, you tell me who's not trying to constantly get money from people to support the church. But that doesn't mean that what they're doing is nefarious. To run a church costs money. There's the upkeep of the building, the people that work there. So I felt that he was being a little too jaded on that particular issue. I don't think people who, that they're going to be doing this, that they're going to be perpetrating a fraud. I don't know, maybe, who knows? But again, it doesn't matter. You know why it doesn't matter? Because these images on the shroud cannot be created. So that precludes an artistic mechanism, and there's absolutely zero evidence that a natural body can create what is seen. Oh, I wanted to bring up too, when you were showing, what was his name, Thomas de Wesselo, the historian, the art historian. If you go back to the screen, and you don't have to, people can rewind. But anyway, to the left, there was a strange thing where you could see a man's buttocks, or at least part of it, and a hand. There you go. All right, there we go. Now that is something that was created through natural means from, if I remember correctly, the gentleman was, the patient was still alive. This image, people refer to it as the Jospice, Jospice mattress. and it was from a hospital in England where there was a patient. If I remember correctly, Dr. Frederick Zegeby, the chief medical examiner from New York, I think Rockland County, he, in Shroud Scholar, he had closely examined this issue with the Jospis mattress because it was certainly something that was relevant in terms of, is this a way of naturally creating an image like the Shroud? It certainly has some characteristics of the Shroud. The problem is, and from what I remember, it's been a long time since I reviewed the details of this case, but if I remember correctly, the patient was suffering from very high bilirubin levels, and I think perhaps he became incontinent while on the mattress in something. I don't remember the details of it, but that's how that image formed. But the bottom line is that when Zegeby, Dr. Zegeby wrote a paper on it. There's also, if somebody Googles it on the internet, you can read all about the Jospis mattress as well as Dr. Zegeby's writings about the Jospis mattress, and you can get all of the details as to how it is distinguished from the body images on the Shroud. So there are many shrouds. Think about it. With especially with Jewish people, the tradition is you bury the person in a shroud, and then usually once the body has become skeletonized, they take the bones out and put it in an ossuary, a bone box. So think about how many times Jews have looked at shrouds that had a decomposing body, yet strangely, there's no mention in all of history of, holy mackerel, what's this? This is the shape of a body. Oh, one other thing too. If I could get something on the photonegativity.
Yeah. I'll just clarify though. This that what Teddy's talking about now again is an image formation question, not historical. But it's about one that's involving a dead body. So this is not an artistic mechanism, anyways, kind of thing. But yeah, I'll let you finish off. And actually, just before you come back, Teddy, and give you, James did clarify. So the 5 elements he had in mind for fraud were a material misrepresentation of fact, 2, knowledge of falsity, scienter, 3, intent to induce reliance, 4, justifiable reliance by the victim, and 5, resulting damages. So that's what he had in mind. But yeah, I'll let you finish your last point.
Sorry, that's my dog. Seeing somebody outside. I'm trying to remember where I left off. What was I talking about?
Photonegativity.
The photonegative, but I was saying something too about but yeah, so there's nobody's seen a body on a shroud before, and there have been tons of shrouds with decomposition, and where a body decomposed on it. Yeah, and also you'd have capillarity with the body fluids. The body image on the shroud exhibits no capillarity like you would get with fluids. So very distinguishable. Regarding what Thomas de Wesselo was referring to, the photonegativity aspects. It's not just that, wow, we've got the evidence of this remarkable image that is so much more detailed in the photonegative, because normally, for all of us people of a certain age, we remember the old cameras with film and what negatives look like. You can't make out the details. You see far more detail to your eye when you're looking at the colored or the black and white processed image. Because back when I was a kid, we also had black and white photos. But anyway, but you never just tended to see more details in the photo negative. And of course, with the shroud, that's one of the interesting things, that you get a much better impression of what the image looked like in the photo negative than in the positive. But what's super fascinating is that it's not even a perfect photo negative, because there will be people that say, oh, well, I could get a negative image if I, scrape, get a pencil and a piece of paper and put a coin underneath and put the lead, on the paper and kind of get an image, and that's going to be the photo negative of it. Oh, big deal. But not so fast. The shroud image is not a perfect photo negative. For example, the hair looks white. It's not like it does not do what a camera does with light. So there are many aspects of photo negativity, but then some that aren't. So even if somebody had managed to come up with the camera back then or whatever, it still wouldn't have worked because it's not a perfect photo negative. So, and also I would mention to people, in the rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm paper that I wrote, in the footnotes, there's a lot of juicy stuff in the footnotes. Please don't omit looking at the footnotes. But there's one really long footnote. I mean, I could probably write a paper on it, probably be worthy of a paper. I get into some fascinating details about photo negatives. And so I invite people to take a look at that footnote. It's got interesting stuff, and in terms of what the eye registers as being certain things in the photo negative. So anyway,
all right.
Sorry, back to you.
All right. So I want to continue on now with his second point, because when it comes to this historical issue of the lack of a chain of custody, Wallace is aware, of course, that there is this attempt on the pro-Shroud side to, as he puts it, to plug that gap with the image of Odessa hypothesis. So first thing, I just want to play a quick little clip of him talking about the image of Odessa. So let me bring that up.
Oh boy, that would be a tough sell in a court of law. And people who believe this is actually legitimate shroud of Turin, the legitimate shroud of Jesus, his burial cloth, they know this is a problem in the story because there's a huge gap. Well, there's lots of, I've been reading about how people deal with this gap in the chain of custody. Well, this is now, if you're looking at it from people who would say, no, it's not a problem for me. Well, why is it not a problem? Well, because I think they would say, I believe many would say, that the shroud is actually something that appears in some literature earlier. And some, for example, will link this to something known as the image of Odessa, which is also known as the Mandalion. And now what is that? Okay, now look, we're going to rabbit trail here for a bit because this is important. If this is the image, the Shroud of Turin is actually the burial shroud of Jesus, well, then we're going to have to solve this problem of nearly 1,400 years of no one talking about it. And I think people who would say this is legitimate, that's going to be the biggest obstacle. The sudden late appearance with nothing in the historical record prior.
Okay, so as you can kind of see there, so he goes into specific details about the image of Odessa. He goes back to, for example, and says, well, your earliest source is Eusebius. Number one, that's fourth. Okay, so put it this way. His objections are, in terms of the image of Odessa, it only goes back, can be traced as far back as the 6th century AD, right? That's when the image of Odessa under that name comes about in the mid 500s there, right? After it's rediscovered in the wall. Well, okay, so let me just, so he could say, and then he says, But there is the image of Edessa is attached to the letter of the legend of Abgar the Fifth, and that would take it back to 30 A.D., where it was taken to Edessa and it was lost for 500 years and then rediscovered in the 6th century. And his objections are, well, look, chain of custody. If I'm looking at the first evidence or document of this Abgar legend, what allows me to take the image of Edessa back to 30 A.D., it's not until Eusebius in the 4th century. And he says he's very doubtful of Eusebius just in general, anyways. But he says, look, it's not good enough because it doesn't mention any kind of imaged cloth. I've raised this objection, right? It only talks about a vision, miraculous vision, or something like that happened. And then his second major argument on the image of Edessa objection is the image of Edessa is a facial image. It has nothing to do with full-length body images. So, yeah, Teddy, I see you champing at the bit there. And you go for the image of Edessa theory. So what is your response to Wallace here on this front?
All right, you ready? I'm going to be long-winded.
All right.
All right.
Try to end minutes, though, if you can. Like, around 10 minutes.
Do what? I didn't hear you.
Well, just keep an eye out. Around 10 minutes.
Okay, right. I can do it in 10 minutes. All right. So, first of all, the whole business with chain of custody. Is it important when collecting evidence? Sure. Because, there have been times when police officers have done hinky stuff with evidence. So, yeah, that is important. And even with the unhinky things, you still need to know where the evidence has been from the time it was collected to make sure that there's not some sort of weird contamination. Detective Wallace made a great point about some things that were stored in a box and the phthalates that ended up coming out and differentiating it from some other piece of evidence. Anyway, I'm not trying to say that in a general case, the provenance of something, the chain of custody is not important to know. But is it the end all be all? No way. Absolutely not. For example, there was a very infamous case of I remember his name was Paul Reed, R-E-I-D, in I'm trying to remember. He went on these killing sprees at different fast food restaurants. It was outside of the Nashville area where I'm at, and they ended up having the trial, if I remember, in Nashville, because they didn't think they could get a unbiased jury pool where it happened. But anyway, my point is, and he was tried. He had several trials because it was several fast food restaurants where he was killing people. Anyway, in one of the particular cases, I remember my one of the prosecutors telling me that the smoking gun on one of the cases, how they were able to pin Paul Reed as the killer in that case, it was the victim's, I think it was his Blockbuster card, like Blockbuster videos, or maybe driver's license. I think it was a Blockbuster card with Paul Reed's bloody fingerprint on it. And it was by the side of, I think, the highway or something like that. Somebody interested in it, Google it. This is a very well-known case. And this was probably around, let's see, I got it at law school in 94. I don't know, maybe around 1998, somewhere around that time. Anyhow, it didn't matter that we couldn't trace, or that it didn't matter in the case that the prosecutor made, that they couldn't specify how the Blockbuster card got from the fast food restaurant to the side of the road. Who cares? I mean, really, what matters is we've got smoking gun evidence there's no reason for Paul Reed's bloody fingerprint to be on this Blockbuster card or driver's license of a victim's that was at the shooting where he's a suspect, unless it's Paul Reed that killed him. And obviously he was going through the victim's wallet trying to get money, and his fingerprint got on the card. So when you got that, again, res ipsa loquitur. If there's anything that people need burned into their brain from today's discussion, it's res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. If there's a murder weapon that's found at the bottom of a river and it's got evidence on it that you can trace it to the murderer and the victim, you don't need to show how it got to the river. The thing speaks for itself. Now, okay, back to the image of death. It's important to note, again, the thing speaks for itself. What is the image of Odessa? A lot of people try to say it's just a face. Again, we've got to go back to the original language, which was Greek. And I'm going to be reading from a translation by Mark Guskin, the professional linguist, and he does translations professionally. But anybody can look up his and read the sermon for themselves. It's beautiful. Now, this sermon was issued by Archdeacon Gregory, who also has the title Referendarius, and he was in charge, the archdeacon at Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. He gives this sermon the day after the image of Edessa comes to Constantinople in great fanfare. And not only that, but what was it, Dale? I'm going from memory. I think it was something like, or maybe I wrote it down, for the Greeks, for the Byzantines to get the image of Edessa from the Muslims, they had to pay something like, I think, they induced the Muslims to fork it over with something like 12,000 pieces of silver, and I think it was the release of 200 Muslim prisoners that the Greeks, the Byzantines, had captive. And I mean, the Byzantines had surrounded Edessa, kind of like with the fork it over or we're invading, we're going to take it. So it was also a great inducement, along with the threat of do it or else we're coming to get it. And you're going to be sorry. So, take the silver, take your prisoners, and give us God's glory. Now, let's get into what Gregory says the day after the image of Edessa arrives in Constantinople. And for people who are interested, this sermon was found in 1986. A Rome classicist, I don't remember what his first name is. It's G. Zaninato or something like that. It was found in the Vatican archives. It's 17 pages. It's Codex Vaticanus Graecus, Graecus, 511, folios 143 through 150 versa. And here we go. Some highlights from Gregory's sermon. The assembly of people is unbelievable because the reason why everybody has come together is almost beyond understanding. Then he goes on to say about the image of Edessa. Pay close attention. It is therefore enough to worship what it is and not for somebody to think that it can be subjected to reason as if it were not so. Now, is Gregory an idiot telling people that they can be idolaters to worship a cloth with just an image or a painting or whatever of Jesus? Is Gregory that ignorant of something as basic as that? Of course not. Why can, now let's just assume for a minute, for the purposes of the discussion, let's assume that this image of Edessa is the Shroud of Turin. What does the Shroud of Turin have on it? Numerous scientific forensic tests show that it is blood. Now, contrary to what so many people keep saying, even people who go under the title of Shroud scholar or Shroud expert that keep telling people that we can show scientifically that the blood is type AB and it's Semitic male and blah, 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 blah. That used to be thought. That is no longer valid science. Stop, people. Stop saying that. It's not valid, and it causes us to lose credibility. Stirp never even said it was human. The most they went to say is that it was primate. The immunological tests that they did, and they knew about cross-reactivity. They tested for all of the known things that were cross-reactive with the antigens back then around 1980 when they did the testing. But now with modern science, we know that there are more different species that can also be cross-reactive. So now it's species unknown in terms of the precise tests that were done back in 1980. Can they do a test right now? Kelly Kearse and I, we were discussing, there is, I don't remember the name of the test, but there is a test. And we were talking about this with Mary Hines as well. There is a test that can confirm whether something is exclusively human or not, but that test has not been done. So right now, all we can do is create a circumstantial case. If you can show that the shroud, the images on it could not have been created by human hands or through a natural process, you see the body images of a male, you see blood stains, and you put two and two together, that's human blood. But that's through a circumstantial case, which in a criminal court, you build a circumstantial case. People think circumstantial evidence isn't as good as direct evidence. That's hogwash. That's not true. Sometimes circumstantial evidence can be some of the best, but it has to be a bunch of evidence that is woven into a web so tightly that the only conclusion can lead to one thing. So there's a very high bar when you're using circumstantial evidence, but we can do that with this. Anyway, what was I talking about? With, I forgot. I lost my train of thought. What was I saying, Dale?
Sorry. I was bringing up the next clip for the next argument there.
Well, anyway, I'll get back about the blood type. So yeah, you can show it's human blood circumstantially, but we don't have direct scientific tests that can narrow it down. But we can narrow it down to it's being blood. But again, this is not blood that has been dripped on or smeared on or painted on. That looks very different. What we have on the shroud, and this is extremely important, we have transfers of blood clot exudates. There are serum halos that have been chemically tested to show that there's albumin. It's serum. So these are blood clots, and you don't get a blood clot with the serum under every circumstance as you put a bandage on a wound. There's some positional issues, and being upright in a crucified position is one of those positions where you would then get a serum halo from a wound from somebody who's bleeding while on the cross. And but so
I
then
do.
so, but it's important to focus that when Gregory in his speech, this is something that I do take issue with Mark Guskin, and I guess I can take issue. I speak Greek. I'm of Greek ethnicity, and grew up speaking both Greek and English. And one of the things stood out to me when I've read Mark Guskin's translation, but I've also read key parts of the sermon in Greek. And he translates a word thrombos or thrombi is drops of blood. But anybody that, if you're thinking about even medical in English, we have, thrombolytic events. It's clots. It's clot or clots in the plural. Gregory Referendarius. Gregory repeatedly uses the words in describing the blood, and in his sermon, he's repeatedly uses the words clots of blood. Now, Mark Guskin has it drops of blood. Go to the Greek. Drops in Greek is stagones. This is clots of blood, and that makes a difference. Why? Because what's on the shroud are clots of blood. Now, Dr. Pierre Barbet, who was the chief surgeon at the St. Joseph Hospital in Paris, even before Stirp did their examination, years before, he was a World War I field surgeon that saw many bloody clothes and bandages from warriors. And when he had an opportunity to see the shroud up close, very, very up close. And he kept talking about these are clots of blood, except there's one area with the foot where it's more of a pooling of blood as opposed to a clot, like more of a dripping. But so let me, hold on, if I can, this is important. I may.
Try to wrap. I give you another 3 minutes. No, 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
This is really, really important because the image of Odessa just shuts up the whole radiocarbon dating thing. So if you could give, just let me finish. This is really
okay. Just before you finish. So I'll give you the time to finish what you need to say, but just a couple things. So. First of all, one of our fans had to go, but they had a message for you. They say, James is saying, I have to go, but a great show. Teddy, you are a much better lawyer than Wallace is an investigator. So you are convincing them. And also, if you can include in your answer, because Wallace mentions that there are a myriad of these imaged cloths. So even if we believe you, about the Gregory Referendarius or any of these mentions, it could be talking about something else other than the Shroud of Turin. So if you want to include an answer to that in your answer as well, right? Like maybe it's another cloth with blood clots on it that's now lost to history or something.
Yeah, there are no cloths with blood clots on it that are purporting to be Jesus's burial shroud with real blood. I've never seen any such evidence. I think from what I remember from Detective Wallace's talk, he was referring not to just, copies like this. He was referring to the documented copies of the shroud where people had permission to go be in front of the shroud, use it as a model so that they could make copies, and that then they would touch the copy to the Holy Shroud, the authentic one, for sanctification purposes. And Wallace was saying, oh, well, gosh, why would somebody do that? He was making it seem like that was somehow disrespectful. Like, why would somebody do that? Well, they're doing that to create another, it would be a third class relic, but to touch anything to a first class relic turns what's been touched to it into a third class relic. So they were creating other shrouds to put in churches so that people could come see it, but they didn't want to just show people a piece of art that some painter made. They wanted to show people something that had, as the Greeks would say, they use it in New Testament and in the Bible scholarship, the ousia, the flavor, the sense, the essence of the shroud through Locard. Detective Wallace will know Locard's principle of contact transfer by taking the painted copy and touching it to the real one. Not only is it touching a cloth that enveloped Jesus, but blood from Jesus is getting onto now the painted copy, so that when people go see that painted copy, they're not just seeing artwork, they are seeing something that probably has, undoubtedly through contact transfer, some blood and some of that, some sort of body essence that, microscopic, but it's there, of Jesus's. And so then that makes it something that's so much more elevated, and it makes it a sacred encounter to go and venerate such a thing. So it's not at all disrespectful, but they didn't realize that when they were touching those cloths, they were leaving little particles of paint onto the cloth. But we'll get later on into iron oxide and stuff like that. Let me get back to the image of Edessa. So Gregory says it is enough to worship this cloth. The only reason why the image of Edessa would be capable of being worshipped, unless Gregory was an idiot in terms of the rules of idolatry, which he wasn't, obviously, is because it has the blood of Christ on it, something that was part of Jesus. And I know, Dale, you and I disagree on this, but if anything comes from Jesus's body, that is sacred and that is worthy of worship. Now, you always tell me, yes, but worship Jesus. Well, of course we worship Jesus, but we worship Jesus and hold him in such high esteem that the tiniest little anything from him is still sacred. Okay. But he says also, Gregory says in his sermon, by the simple touching to the face of Christ, an image of his form was made. That doesn't say face, form. So he then now Gregory tries to, very smart of Gregory, in terms of cellulosic yellowing. I mean, we all know that you can get, yellow stains, for example, underneath the arms where people sweat. Old T-shirts and stuff like that over time can start getting yellow. I mean, it's not like Gregory would be ignorant of these things. So Gregory, in his wisdom, I mean, he wasn't right, but it was a good try. He was thinking that this image was done through some sort of cellulosic yellowing, which of course sweat can do. And so this is why he is hypothesizing that he says, taking this linen cloth, he as in Jesus, wiped the sweat that was falling down his face like drops, really should be clots, of blood in his agony. And miraculously, just as he made everything from nothing in his divine strength, he imprinted the reflection, like the energy of the resurrection, the reflection of his form on the linen. Again, he mentions form requested, came into being on it. Then we have, again, he says, what?
Do you have much more? Just
almost done.
Okay.
Then he says, you wiped clean this, meaning Jesus, you wiped clean the sweat of the nature you had taken on, and what was wiped clean was transformed into an image of your unchanging form, not just face. And then he says, for years, look at what he refers to the image of Edessa as being. For years, your glory resided with those you considered worthy, the disciples and probably the church father, who knows, but Christians. For many years, your glory resided with those you considered worthy. Now it has been united to those things, reunited because they got it from the Muslims who had it, reunited with those things held in honor by your chosen people, the Christians, the cane, your nails, the cross, and the other objects through which we receive mercy and in which we are always strengthened. Notice, he doesn't refer to the cane, the nails, the cross, and the other objects as his glory. It's the shroud that's his glory. The shroud is differentiated. Why? Because his glory is his form and as evidence from the resurrection. I mean, it's, and I think that's it. Wait a minute. And then he talks about regarding whether the image is a painting. He says, for this is not the art of painting, which provides a door for the mind to consider the original and depicts images. This reflection was imprinted from a living original. Now, one is going to say, oh, is he saying that it occurred from life? Well, it depends on how you take that. I mean, Jesus was living incarnate on earth. And so one could say that somebody who is dead is now living. But of course, at the moment of resurrection, Jesus is living. So it can work that way. He says, this reflection, however, let everyone be inspired with the explanation, has been imprinted only by the sweat from the face of the originator of life. I think that is where people think that it is only a face. But he's just kind of drawing imagery from Gethsemane, falling like drops of blood and by the finger of God. But he's not saying that the image, he's saying the sweat came from the face, but he's not saying that the image is only of the face, because he repeatedly refers to the form. And if he was talking about just the face, he would just say the face. For these are the beauties that have made up the true imprint of Christ, since after the drops, really clots, fell, it was embellished by drops, really clots, from his own side. So there are additional references here to the side wound.
Okay.
So, and he talks about one last thing, origin of the
We're losing the eye. It's
people who are really interested are going to care. The flibbity gibbets that just want something fast and popular level, they can go somewhere else. They want to know the details. Let them listen to this.
Yeah, for the jump, I want to summarize in case like Wallace's fans are in the audience.
The origin of the image made by sweat is in fact of the same nature as the origin, Jesus, of that which makes the liquid flow from the side. What do we see on the shroud? On the side wound, the lance wound, we see liquid flowing post-mortem. It's not a blood splatter like you would expect if there's a beating heart. It just comes down. Anyway, so, okay, that's my main stuff. Thank you. It's super important because the image of Edessa is, there are problems with the radiocarbon testing, but we'll get into that later. But the image of Edessa is important. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. So I do agree with Teddy that, getting into these details are important and that sort of thing. But I also want to be mindful that for Wallace, if you're listening to this and your friend, getting into this much detail on one source, I want to make clear that the case for the image of Edessa isn't just dependent on this one source that Teddy was giving. She happens to think this is the best documentary evidence, and that's why she singled that out. But there are other texts that would support the image of Edessa hypothesis that people would appeal to and that sort of thing. So I just want that to be clear for the audience, that it's not just one proof text from the 10th century that makes up the case. Now, what I want, Warner Wallace, what I would think is that, what in terms of my own take on this issue, is that I always find it interesting because, Teddy, you and I have a disagreement here. I don't think the image of Edessa hypothesis is true. I kind of was nodding my head to some of the criticisms Wallace was giving and saying, yeah, the facial image, this is a huge problem kind of thing. And what I guess what I would like his fans to know is that the image of Edessa hypothesis is not the only game in town. There's at least 3 to 4 historical hypotheses, 2 of which are probably the main competitors. So there's Ian Wilson's image of Edessa hypothesis, but then there's my friend Jack Marquardt, who's going to be on the channel this Thursday debating with Otangelo Grasso his theory called the image of God incarnate hypothesis. And this proposes an alternative plausible history to plug that 14-year gap that Wallace was talking about. And it just seemed to me that Wallace was totally ignorant of these other alternative historical hypotheses. And if it is something that you are going to be researching in as an investigator, I would expect you to dig a little bit deeper or try to find out all the available hypotheses out there, not just evaluate the Shroud on the basis of one. And so Jack goes for the image of God incarnate hypothesis. Basically, that just says instead of going to Edessa, the Shroud went to Antioch for the first 500 years. And then in the 6th century, it was taken to Constantinople, where it remained until the 13th century, when it was finally taken to Liry, France. So I just wanted you to be aware there are alternatives there. But I won't waste time going into various details. Check out my show with Jack Marquardt if you're interested in, what are the evidence for these different hypotheses for and against. So I want to move on because we have about 3 to 4 other topics. And you just mentioned the next one. There's the carbon dating, and he contrasts this with the wax. So I just want to first play his clip about the carbon dating. This is what Wallace says in a nutshell on that front. Okay. This one. All right.
Now let's come to a kind of a big turning point event that occurred with the Shroud in 1988. I think this is kind of a cool thing. The British Museum got involved in this, and they took samples, small samples from the same spot on the all 3 samples from the same spot on the Shroud. It was a small corner, and they sent them to independent labs under a kind of like a blind test where and it was all overseen, by the way, by the British Museum. So they ended up in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson. And all 3 used what's called AMS, which is accelerator mass spectrometry. This really at the time in 1988, and probably still is it's the gold standard for radiocarbon dating, especially the radiocarbon dating of small textile samples. So 3 tests, not knowing what the other is doing, all 3, the lab results, when they're statistically combined, the calibrated age of that piece, that piece they took from the corner, is anywhere from 1260 to 1390. And they reported at the time that they had a 95% confidence level that was when it would be dated. And
all right, and I just want to skip ahead to the wax part. It's okay, wax. Oh shoot. Okay, so it's around the 1 hour, 1 minute mark, I think, of memory. All right. So now he is contrasting the carbon dating, which he says is the gold standard, right? And he says has been proven to be reliable, that the Shroud's medieval. But the Pro-Shroud side, we have our own independent scientific dating tests proving the Shroud goes back to the 1st century. the most famous of which is this wax dating. So hopefully he's going to be talking about that soon.
The threads are twisted, is mechanically similar to what we see in ages of whatever decade or whatever century this might be. And those folks who do that, this mechanical optical aging studies, just looking at like how is it woven, how is it constructed, they will often say that points to something older than the 13th or 14th century. And then, of course, we've also got what's known as waxes, which is wide angle X-ray scattering, WAXS. And there was an Italian scientist, and what he did, he also had some colleagues who helped him with this, is he looked at the kind of crystalline structure of one of the threads, of cellulose in one of the threads. And it's from very near the sampling corner that was taken in 1988. And so what they did was they compared this with something they think is from the first century, in this case, the siege of Masada. And they actually argue that this behaves in many ways when tested this way. The results are very similar to what you might expect from a 2,000-year-old piece of fabric. So there have been a couple of attempts, at least, to push back against that 1988 carbon dating with a couple of other systems that actually seem to incline to an older date. But
all right. Oh, actually, if he's gonna, okay, yeah. So I'll go back. So basically, I'll give my take first on this issue. So, in the first place, on the carbon-14 dating, I was a little bit. I did notice a little bit of a double standard on Wallace's part, because he basically says, well, when it comes to the pro-shroud things like the wax dating or the mechanical tensile strength tests that our mutual friend Giulio Fonte did, along with other scientists, these are highly sensitive to various environmental factors, which, because the shroud isn't proven, it's a, technically speaking, an unknown, all of the circumstances it was in. And this means according to Wallace, you can't rely on any dating that you get. Whereas carbon dating, he says, this is the gold. AMS carbon dating was the gold standard. So I want to start with carbon dating. In the first place, no, it wasn't. At the time in 1988, and this is published in 3 peer-reviewed journals in Radiocarbon, the scientific journal there, not a Christian Puff piece, but in the Radiocarbon journal, proving that AMS was horrible. It had a 40% failure rate. That's horrible, especially when you think that there was only 3 labs involved in dating the shroud. Maybe all 3 of them got it wrong for some reason. But in the radiocarbon journals, they did prove that carbon dating performed horribly. And this was especially in relation to dating textiles, which I'll leave. That's one of Teddy's points, so I'll leave that for her talking point. But outside of that, outside of those issues, there have been proven issues with the carbon dating published in a total of 6 peer-reviewed journals in relation to the subsample dates that they got. And basically, the 12 subsamples create a gradient if you draw a line of best fit. And this proves that there's a systematic bias which is affecting the results. They're too different from each other. It's not falling within the random measurement error perspective. And this begs the question of, okay, well, what is it that's affecting the dates? What is this systematic bias? What's causing that, right? And that's where you have to come in. Okay, well, pro-shroud guys will come in and say it's neutron irradiation, or Teddy will come in and say, no, it's an invisible reweave that's influencing the results and stuff like that. And skeptics will come up with their own answer, kind of thing. But the point is, these are all hypotheses trying to explain this problematic data that was revealed in the peer-reviewed literature in 2019 when Tristan Casabianco published his paper. And what I find interesting is not only do skeptics, and in Wallace's case, he doesn't mention these alternatives that on the face of them are equally probable explanations, but he doesn't get into any of the evidence for and against the alternative. So in the case of the skeptic alternative answer, they basically said, well, maybe the labs had different cleaning procedures, and this is what's causing this bias in the results that we're seeing. There's no proof for that. That's just sheer skeptical speculation. It's them dreaming stuff up in their heads. There's no proof that any differences in the pre-cleaning treatment actually affected the shroud dates. But what about on the pro-shroud side with neutron irradiation, even the invisible reweave? There is evidence, and I don't buy the invisible reweave myself, but there is evidence that's supporting it, and I would expect you to at least talk about that. And same deal with the neutron irradiation. We have evidence published in the Applied Optics Journal from the ultraviolet fluorescence intensity levels, which corresponds precisely with Bob Rucker's MCNP computer calculations based on the neutron irradiation. And guess what? Science just happens to prove that neutron irradiation, if it happened, does indeed affect ultraviolet fluorescence intensity levels in precisely the way that we see on the Shroud of Turin. This is evidence saying, yeah, the shroud was probably neutron irradiated. And again, Wallace doesn't go into any of that. He just kind of says, well, hey, we all know carbon dating works. We can just trust it and let's just go with it. So that was one treatment. And on the Wax's side, he's correct in his criticism, but it just seems it's a little bit out of date because number one, Giulio Fonte and Liberato De Caro are well aware of the fact that their dating technique, Wax and the others, are affected by things like temperature, humidity, all of these factors. And they took that into account. They have very wide margins of error. It's like something like plus or minus 400 years. And that totally takes care of the issue. It's not beyond, it can't be wrong more than 400 years based on the data. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand when it comes to Wax. There's two fundamental conclusions. One proven beyond all reasonable doubt, okay? And that's the first is that the shroud, it's impossible for the shroud to be medieval. It is centuries older than the medieval period. That's proven beyond all reasonable doubt. No matter what, unless you posit, okay, maybe the shroud was on the surface of the sun or some kind of alien planet, no matter what conditions the shroud were in, the shroud cannot be medieval. Wax proves that, absolutely. Now, when it comes to is the shroud first century, there's a little more wiggle room, as I said, and that's why they give such wide margins of error, plus or minus 400 years kind of thing, right? 54 AD plus or minus 400 years or something like that. And there's a 95% degree of confidence that it falls within that range. So those are the two things that I wanted to say there. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it to you, Teddy, with Wax, I'm always frustrated a little bit with skeptics who they cite the 2019 paper and then the April 2022 paper, but then they leave it at that. They never cite the third paper where Giulio Fonte and Dr. Liberato De Caro, it published in November 2022, where they got into these assumptions and started making more realistic estimates based on the four plausible histories for the Shroud of Turin. So they've actually corrected to some extent some of the issues or the assumptions that were in the first paper that Wallace cites and that all the skeptics cite, but they never cite the follow-up paper, which at least progressed our understanding and helped to mitigate against some of those issues. So with that, I will shut up, and Teddy, I'll give it over to you for your take on the carbon dating versus the Wax and the pro-shroud dating things.
So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the Wax method or radiocarbon dating. So I'll just leave that to people who are far more into that. And I don't find the need to push myself to get into all of those details. And I'll give you the reasons why. Well, first of all, if you go with Bob Rucker's hypothesis, if that's true, then the 1988 radiocarbon dating results are correct, but they're misinterpreted, meaning they shouldn't be interpreted as saying that the shroud's a medieval fake, but that with Bob's hypothesis, if you were to test different areas of the shroud, you would be getting different radiocarbon dates based on, I think, the neutron absorption. But so my Okay, so I'm going to be very lawyerish about this. My interest is, quite frankly, because people might say it's, you know, it's just a problem, but it's not necessarily a problem if you go with Bob Rucker's hypothesis. But I'm going to argue in the alternative. So if it's correct, well, great. That supports Bob Rucker's hypothesis. If it's incorrect, I'll tell you why there is very good reason to doubt in this purported gold standard. Well, first of all, anybody that knows anything about gold knows that even gold can tarnish, especially if it's not 24 karat. And the radiocarbon dating method is certainly not 24 karat gold. I mean, I remember in college, in my physical anthropology class, we learned a little bit about radiocarbon dating, and they refer to it as the gold standard even back then. But it's not perfect. Every archaeologist knows there are cases where things that they really have very excellent confidence in what the dating is based on other things around it, and they get some wacky radiocarbon dating. Well, why? Because we all know that contamination can throw off radiocarbon dating, and lots of things that are carbon dated are contaminated. So then it's a question of the reliability of the cleaning procedures. I'll get to that in a second. But so there have been times even when things that were radiocarbon dated ended up getting a date into the future. So if that's not phenomenal evidence of how radiocarbon dating is not always totally accurate, plus the breakdown of carbon isn't always the same throughout the ages. Sometimes there can be little changes, and that's known. And the experts try to account for that. But are they going to really have that much hubris to think that they've figured out all of the little blips, since the first century that exists? I doubt it. Anyway, aside from that, let's go to Beta Analytics. They are the largest, or purported to be the largest, radiocarbon dating lab in the world. They're out of Florida. They, not just a couple of years ago, changed their name. So it's not Beta Analytics. It's, I think, maybe Beta Lab Services, something like that. Google Beta Analytics, you'll find the website. Now, I remember looking at their website several years ago, like about 5 years ago, as well as now. It's changed a little bit, but there are still some similarities. Still to this day, if you look at where they discuss the radiocarbon dating of textiles, they specify that textiles to be radiocarbon dated, they need to be dated as part of a multidisciplinary process. Now, if that's not an argument, or if that's not an admission against interest, as we lawyers would say, then I don't know what is. They are admitting that, particularly when radiocarbon dating textiles, that you can't, you don't want to just do it with radiocarbon dating. You want to look at other ways of trying to assess the date of a textile because it might not be right. That's a very clear admission. The other thing is that with regard to, in general, on their website, they talk about how the radiocarbon dating results, you shouldn't just take that as, the gospel truth, because it depends on the integrity of the sample. So if a sample is problematic for whatever reason, that can affect the date. Now, I remember, I haven't been able to find it on their current website, but I do remember on their prior website, and if people want to think I'm a liar, then they can think I'm a liar, but I give you my word that I remember reading this. They specify, this is just tremendous. They specified to be sure to not smoke in front of any samples that are to be radiocarbon dated. Now, why can't I, not that I smoke, but I mean, why can't I smoke 10 packs of Marlboros, right on blowing smoke onto a sample? If their cleaning procedures are all that they're cracked up to be, it shouldn't matter, right? If their cleaning procedures are that great. But apparently they must not be. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to warn people to not smoke. Just smoke, my goodness. To not do that in front of the samples. Obviously, with the implication being that could skew the date. Otherwise, why would they say it? So that shouldn't even be debated. Now, the Shroud was in 2 fires, and the reliquary that it was in was breached both times, particularly in the fire of 1532, where we get all these scorch marks. So, no, there was, I think it was a Russian scientist that did some sort of study way back when. It's very controversial. Some people have claimed that it has been debunked. I'm not so sure about that. And whether there was something not great about his study, that still does not mean that the exposure to smoke and in the reliquary, when there was a breach in the fire of 1532, water got in that, and that did all sorts of things with the steam. And who knows what that did, but there was plenty of smoke damage because we see scorch and burn marks. So, for these reasons, and I seem to recall too saying that they were saying that be careful, if there's water damage, if a sample has experienced water damage. Well, where they took the sample, it was right by a water stain. I can't remember if it was exactly within a water or impinging a little bit on a water stain or right next to it. You'd have to go look at that for sure. But so that's a little bit iffy, but I just throw in the water damage anyway. But being extremely iffy. But anyway, but the main thing is that it's a textile, the Shroud. So right then it says multidisciplinary process. What does the body of evidence point to the Shrouds being? Authentic, because nobody can recreate this thing. So, then you have the radiocarbon dating as an outlier. And that's precisely what beta analytics is saying. Don't get caught up if the radiocarbon dating is an outlier, which it is with the Shroud. So, that's pretty much my take on radiocarbon dating. And I just basically focus on neutralizing it as an issue and let the other evidences sing and just not worry about the radiocarbon dating, because the radiocarbon dating lab is and the other thing too, Detective Wallace was mentioning that it was that the tests were done blind. They were not done blind. They knew precisely which sample was the Shroud because none of the other samples had a herringbone weave, which is extremely visibly noticeable. And the reason why they didn't have a sample as a control that was a herringbone weave, so they couldn't find one. The British Museum couldn't find one, which shows you that Joseph of Arimathea got with his wealth, he ended up finding a very fine fabric to wrap Jesus in. So anyway, that's that.
All right. All right. So yeah, I'm just going to share my screen just to move on to the next topic. But before we do, I just want to show people the paper. So this is the third paper that none of the skeptics know about or talk about. The long-term temperature effects on the natural linen aging of the Turin Shroud by Liberato De Caro, Cesar Barda, Giulio Fonte. And this is where they go into addressing some of the assumptions they made in the prior paper and, fixing that and being more specific. kind of thing. So yeah, this needs to be read and addressed, and I don't see Wallace or any of the skeptics addressing this. Now, the next issue that came up before we get into your favorite, he talks about the pollen evidence and dust findings and stuff like that. So let me just play what he says on the pollen findings here.
For example, on this pollen issue, about 2016, a paper from people in the very same discipline here, they actually made a pretty important proposition. I think it's worth looking at. They said, hey, you know these pollen types that you're seeing? It's not like this is transferring through the air. These are not just airborne geographic markers. These were the kinds of pollen you would expect to find in all of the oils and anointing oils and all the resins, all the stuff that was used in classic burial shrouds. In other words, these are the kinds of things, the spices that were applied to a corpse. And they weren't necessarily airborne pollen. So you can't really use them as geographic markers in that way. And not only that, you cannot tell. Again, remember we talked about how do you know how it was stored? How do you know what it's been exposed to? That might explain some of this pollen. Like as if we know with absolute certainty the kind of micro, it sounds great, but the problem is that so much of this could be from contamination. It's been on display for hundreds of years. It's been handled. It's been stored. There have been people who have put their copies against this.
Okay, so I missed a little bit in the beginning there, but he talks about Max Frey, who was the first person in the 1970s to identify various species, and his argument was we can prove this came from Jerusalem. The shroud was in the area around Jerusalem, and Wallace mentions, and I believe rightly so, that there have been certain problems by subsequent researchers on that front, where they say, well, Max Frey, he deserves a lot of credit. He was a pioneer in the field, but he got some things wrong, things that are obviously wrong in the field of palynology for experts today, but wouldn't have been obvious back in his time in the 1970s. And because of that, skeptics will say, well, you can't really use the pollen to prove, oh, it was in the vicinity of Jerusalem specifically. Maybe at best you can prove it's consistent with a Jerusalem origin, but it's also consistent with other areas in the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean as well, kind of thing. And I personally, I'll be interested to see how Teddi comes back, but I personally agree with that. I don't use the pollen evidence for a precise geographic thing or argue, see, we can prove the species of these. I try to take the 2016 Dr. Marzia Boy, who's published in peer-reviewed papers in the literature, and she says, okay, we can argue for the genus, but there are important indications for the dating. Forget the geography. We can date the shroud to ancient times because there are certain pollen grains and such. In fact, in the case of the Sudarium of Oviedo, something Wallace didn't bring up at all, there's even a pollen grain that's embedded in a bloodstain, meaning we can prove it was there at the original time. And these were used for ancient funeral rituals, which were not used after that time. And these are mentioned in people like Pliny the Elder, for example, talking about these rituals. And these rituals stopped being enacted after the great crisis of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. So this means for dating purposes, we can make an argument that, okay, probably the shroud dates and got these pollen grains on them sometime in the 3rd century or earlier, while these funeral rituals were being advanced. And that's where I think an interesting argument can at least be made based on the pollen grains for dating. Forget about proving it's Jerusalem specific, exclusively Jerusalem. The evidence just isn't there yet. But Teddi, what's your take on the pollen grains?
Well, with all the time that I took with my extra time with my Gregory sermon, you'll be making up for it because my answer is short and sweet, which I'm sure Hal just froze over with that statement. But anyway, look, I have not. I'm aware of the pollen evidence. I learned about it when I first started reading about the Shroud many years ago. And then I started hearing a lot of attacks against it. I think it's very unsettled. And I think that even if you probably get the evidence at its best level, it's still kind of a secondary evidence. I don't use it. I've never once used it in my arguments because I want to only put arguments in my case that I think are as bulletproof as possible and that I can just win.
Okay. Teddy, so I muted you for a second. I have a question for you then to include. If you're still giving your answer in the poll, and that's fine. But after you finish that, I noticed in the comments a lot of pro Shroud guys were kind of criticizing Jay Warner Wallace's video on the comments under his video and saying he left so much out. So, for example, he never talked about the Sudarium of Oviedo or the Prey Codex. So I'm just wondering, do you think there's anything he left out that would make a difference or anything? So, yeah, continue your answer on the pollen and then finish with that.
Yeah, I mean, so with the pollen, I just, it's not, to me, first-class evidence. So just, I'm not worried about it. I'm not particularly interested in it. I mean, it had, at one point in the early years of my studying, sound stuff, but I just don't think it can be proved to the level of what it needs to be. I mean, you could bring it up as corroborating evidence that may or may not, but we don't need that. We got first-class evidence, so I tell people stick with the good stuff, the great stuff. Regarding, what was the other thing you mentioned?
Stuff
Sudarium.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Sudarium, I mean, I read about that many years ago. I know some details about it. I know some arguments against it. Same thing with the Hungarian Prey Codex. I don't consider those first-class pieces of evidence either. Now, I think that there's, I'd say a high probability that both of them are legit, that the Prey Codex was depicting Christ. That's a little bit more iffy. I think there's a high probability that the Sudarium is legitimately the face cloth that was on top of Christ. But am I going to use that in my arguments? No, I'm not, because I don't feel like I've got a winning rebuttal to what the critics are going to say. And if I don't have a winning rebuttal, I ain't using it. So that's where I stand on that. I don't use those. I don't need those. I focus in on the chemistry tests, the physics-based tests, logic, reason, history, context, but really especially forensics, chemistry, and physics. That's what I go for.
All right, perfect. So now we come to the final topic, and the good news is you have been sprinkling in your own take about the image formation question throughout the show and that sort of thing. But there's a particular aspect he does mention and contrast Stirp's findings about paint versus Walter McCrone, the dreaded Shroud skeptic there. So I know you're going to have a lot to say about Walter McCrone. So why don't and he also appeals to the fact, he admits it's not that McCrone was out to lunch. It's not a traditional painting to explain it. But he appeals to someone that used paint, Luigi Garlascelli. So what I want to do is I'll have you respond to the Walter McCrone aspect, and then I want to play a clip of even you, me, Mark Guskin, and the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry himself. And he recently denied this. So we're going to see him in his own words, where he's criticizing Garlascelli's method and saying it doesn't work. But yeah, I want to first turn it over to you to cover the Walter McCrone stuff.
Well, and if I could just briefly say before I get into the McCrone, because I'm going to go a little bit longer on the Macron. But with the Garlic Skelly, that show that you and Mark Guskin and Hugh and I did together, was it a year ago or something like that? Yeah. 2 Christmases ago, roughly. Towards the opening, you asked me for my take. I came in at the last minute as a guest, but I think I gave a really good and surprisingly really fast rundown and takedown of the whole Garlic Skelly method, including the fact that Garlic Skelly himself agrees that he has not managed to accomplish the image formation process. But I get into all of those details. And so we can perhaps link to that.
Yeah. What I can do.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. What I can do, it makes more sense maybe to do it. Let me play the clip, because I think for this, and go and watch Teddy's introduction, Mark Guskin, and that sort of thing. But I have a clip of what Hugh Ferry himself says, and the reason he's relevant for fans in the audience like Wallace and stuff. He's a skeptic. He's the ultimate Shroud skeptic, and even he is saying Garlic Skelly's method, it's not up to par. So, yep. Hang on. Yeah.
And Dale, if memory serves, like after I went on my big soliloquy on Garlic Skelly, I don't seem to, which was shocking, I don't seem to recall Hugh arguing with me or taking issue with anything that I said. He seemed to pretty much be in agreement with it.
He was nodding. Yeah.
So,
all right. So let's just knock Garlic water, and then we'll get the crony stuff. All right. Sharing screen. All right. So I think I got the timestamp. We're coming in right after Teddi gave her opening speech. And again, I'm going to include the link to this show in my blog. So check out this entire panel. It was great. But I'm just coming in, I think, with Hugh here.
With it.
And Teddi, just to wrap this point up, and then I want to go to Mark. So in a minute or so.
Sure. But even Garlic Skelly talks about the problems of artificial aging. So he acknowledges that. He acknowledges that his slurry gives a very uneven image because it creates too much of a wrapping distortion and it creates harsh lines and not the blurred edges. So honestly, Garlic Skelly is sinking his own hypothesis, and he presumes that there is some sort of a catalytic, agent such as an acid in the original red ochre, and he thinks that that's that the remnants of that are what caused the etching or the dehydration.
And just to clarify, Wallace, you might not know Garlic Skelly is. He's the one who in 2009 did the experiments with the bas relief and then the pigments technique. So that's what we're talking about here, just for context. The bas relief pigment method.
Oxidation of the cellulose. Yet if you've got, for example, red ochre doing that, that's more like foxing, and foxing on cellulose tends to grow over time, yet the body image on the shroud has not grown or become distorted over time, as we can see from prior attempts at drawing or painting it from the medieval times. So anyway, that's just
awesome.
Quick.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much there, Teddi. I appreciate that. And now, Mark, I want to turn to you. Same question. Give kind of in about 6 to 8 minutes or so your opening as to what your understanding of Garlic Skelly's method is, and what's your take on how it performs? No, bro, sorry. 6 to 8 minutes or so it is, and what is your take on it? Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me just say that some years ago, I actually met Garlic Skelly with his Shroud mock-up in Italy when I was filming a documentary with the National Geographic, okay? And two interesting things to say about that. A, this is purely a subjective opinion, this first part, but his product of the Shroud, to my mind, just looked like one of the numerous medieval copies of the Shroud. Didn't look anything like it, like the original. It looked like a copy. And then, secondly, I asked him directly about the blood stains, and he said, "Oh yeah, first I did the body, and then I put the blood stains on the top of it. How was I going to put the blood stains on first?" And that, again, just like means the whole thing is wrong. You cannot take that into account. If somebody is going to reproduce the Shroud, reproduce anything, not only the Shroud, but any object, it has to reproduce every single aspect, every single property that the original, in this case, Shroud object in general, has. And automatically, just with the thing of the blood stains, you know, saying, how was I going to put them on before doing the body, is like saying, okay, that's the end of that then. Your copy is not a valid copy. Therefore, the methodology that you have come up with does not, it's quite ingenious, but it does not give us an explanation as to how the image on the Shroud of Turin was formed. No matter what that image is or isn't, no matter when the Shroud dates from, Garlaskelli's reproduction is just another copy, the same as so many that you can see all over Europe, and I do believe there are some in the United States as well. But it is not an explanation of how the original Shroud image was formed. And that is not a statement either in favor or against authenticity. It's a purely scientific, artistic statement that I would find very difficult to argue with, because he himself admitted that he hadn't followed the order of events that we do know took place when the Shroud of Turin image was formed. So, you know, I think he's getting way too much publicity for having painted a copy of the Shroud. It's not an explanation. And he admitted as much to me in person.
Awesome. Yeah.
All right. So that was Mark Guskin. I thought Hugh was going to go next, but now I think we're coming to Hugh. And this is the Shroud skeptic in the top right here. So let's see what Hugh Ferry says about Garlashelli. Does he think it works or not? So yeah, Wallace, you should really pay attention to what Hugh says.
Thanks so much for that, Mark. And I'll just say, yeah, there are apparently videos when he was at a panel admitting that his, obviously for privacy reasons, they can't be shown because they're not publicly available, but he fully admits that his method is insufficient, apparently. So, but that said, I want to go straight to you, Hugh. And now is the time for your kind of uninterrupted opening for about 6 to 8 minutes. Same questions. What is your understanding of Garlaskelli's method? What is it? And what's your general take on it?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, people who like to think that the Shroud is not authentic have taken Garlaskelli's experiments as quite often to be the definitive answer to the authenticist claim, which is not what Garlaskelli ever claimed himself. He was experimenting with possible ways in which the Shroud could have been produced in the Middle Ages. And he tried several ways, some of which worked in some characteristics and some of which worked in others. But he never at any point claims that he has decided that he's found out how the Shroud was made. In fact, he particularly goes out of his way in his, I've got his document here, what's it called? The life-size reproduction of the Shroud of Turin and its image, to say he hasn't definitively explained exactly how it was. What he's done is, like myself later on, as you'll see, is come up with various arguments or various methods by which we might continue to explore how to get a more and more precise reproduction of the shroud as we see it. He begins, I mean, he the very beginning of his paper is not, I'm trying to prove by my experiments that the shroud is medieval. He is assuming from the start that the shroud is medieval. And he's going from there to say, if the shroud is medieval, how was it done? And that, of course, is how I've been going about it.
All right, so I think that gives you guys enough context there. And you can see even Garla Shelley himself, eyewitnesses. Mark Guskins talked to Garla Shelley, interviewing for National Geographic, and Hugh Ferry, who's the ultimate shroud skeptic and communicates with him by email all the time. Garla Shelley himself admits, and I paraphrase it, yeah, his method sucks. It doesn't reproduce the shroud. And apparently it was never meant to. It was just an experimental attempt to get as close as he could, but close but no cigar is the end results that he got. And you saw it yourself. Even Hugh Ferry himself admits that. And Hugh is quoting Garla Shelley himself admitting that. So you should be aware of that, Wallace. If you're hearing that or as fans, that Garla Shelley's method is not the solution that, CNN articles might make it sound like and stuff like that. So I just wanted to clarify that. So Teddy, over to you. If you have anything else to say about Garla Shelley quickly, but also transition into Macron.
Well, so, with Garla Shelley, what kind of scientist is he? I mean, I know he's a chemist, but what caliber of scientist is he when he's making assumptions about things? You're not supposed to make assumptions about stuff when you're doing science, or at least not good science. I mean, you just start from the beginning and see where it goes and see what you can prove and see what you see. And you don't do that when making an argument either. I see some people, including even some people who write and talk about shroud matters, where they will make assumptions about things. No, you can't make assumptions. You can show evidence for things and build a case, but you don't make assumptions. That is just building, a house of cards that's just going to blow away with, one big, little blowing on the thing, and it just all falls apart. So, don't do it. Don't assume anything. Find the evidence, build it up, and then go from there. You ready for Macron?
Yep. Go ahead.
All right. So, Walter Macron, he was and is considered the father of modern microscopy. Sorry, that's my dog snoring. So he was considered the father of modern microscopy. And, he was a big deal. He got to examine famous paintings, masterpieces to determine whether they were authentic or not. He was called in to determine about the Vinland map. And honestly, the funny thing is, the radiocarbon dating of the Vinland map ended up going against what Walter Macron was saying, but it's still very controversial. Who knows? And also, who knows how many things Walter seemed to love to debunk things and telling people that they had fakes, and God only knows how many fakes there are, things that he told people are fakes that might not be fakes. Who knows? I mean, because obviously we can tell from his work on the Shroud that I don't care who he was or what his reputation is. Again, res ipsa loquitur, and the work that he did regarding the Shroud speaks for itself, and it speaks to someone who had a sloppy methodology. So let's begin. The way he got involved in this was he was good friends with Stirp chemist from Los Alamos, Ray Rogers. They had been friends for decades. And of course, with Rogers is knowing that McCrone was somewhat of a celebrity in terms of microscopy, because he literally he kind of wrote the book on microscopy with the particle atlas. I own it. But then it became a whole series of books. But anyway, so McCrone loved the polarized light microscope, and he admits in his own book, Judgment Day for the Shroud of Turin, that he felt that it was becoming obsolete and people weren't paying attention to it. And so he loved it, it was his microscope. And he wanted for it to kind of have this resurrection of sorts, in terms of just to be the thing that solved the case of the Shroud, and it gets celebrated along with him getting celebrated and all of that. And so initially when he got the tape, so when Ray Rogers he ordered some sticky tape, kind of like Scotch tape, and from the 3M Corporation. And he told the 3M Corporation to make it where it is not optically active. But turns out it was, and Heller and Adler describe it in detail, that it definitely was optically active. The problem is, so when Ray Rogers, and they even created a tool to apply the sticky tape onto the Shroud, so that all of the samples, each tape, I think there was 36 tapes, and each one had probably about 1,000 fibers and particles, and as Heller would say, the dust of ages on it. Dr. John Heller, who was also part of the STIRP team, who did the chemistry along with Dr. Alan Adler, the chemist. But anyway, so Rogers collects these samples where they would press the tape onto the Shroud, lift it up, think of like a lint roller that, you roll it on something and you got all these fibers and things on it. So they're examining it microscopically. And what Rogers told McCrone, no, be careful, do not open these tapes anywhere unless it's a clean room, don't mess with it. And McCrone said, well, I might need to cut some things. And he said, well, just be very careful, don't do much. I mean, Rogers was so upset with McCrone. That was the biggest mistake of his life, to give those to McCrone to examine first. But McCrone ended up bungling the tapes when he finally, he didn't return them. They had to go get them because they kept asking for the tapes back. And STIRP team members, John Jackson, Eric Jumper, and Ray Rogers had to go to McCrone's lab in Chicago to go get them from him. Anyway, but they were in disastrous shape after McCrone was finished with them. But anyway, so McCrone, what he did was he ended up getting the sticky tapes, and you have your microscope, your glass microscope slide. He got the tape and then just slapped it down onto the microscope slide, and he was using the tape basically as a cover glass. And he felt, well, that protects the samples because the tape's stuck on the glass. Well, the problem is, especially with this tape, is that it was optically active. So when he was looking through purely microscopy, he didn't do any chemical testing at this point. Through microscopy with his polarized light microscope, he's looking through the sticky tape at the particles. What does that do? Okay, iron oxide, which would be like ochre pigment, particularly red ochre or hematite, has a refractive index of around 3.0. Blood has a refractive index of about 1.5. But when he was looking at the red particles through this optically active sticky tape, it first of all, it made the red particle. Blood is isotropic and it's not birefringent. red ochre, hematite, iron oxide, those are anisotropic and birefringent. So in looking through this tape, which you never should have done it that way, or at least you should have confirmed that it wasn't optically active, it threw off the refractive index, and it made what the red particles that he was looking at, it made them appear anisotropic and birefringent. And because of that, he then concluded, which, I mean, if you get that data, sure, it's natural to conclude it's iron oxide. And what pigments look like iron oxide? Hematite. Well, the funny thing is, he even gets that wrong. For somebody who specializes in looking at little things, he gets the little details dead wrong. First of all, he says that it's red ochre. Red ochre is, and I, as someone who's dabbled with paints and stuff like that, I pulled out, I went and bought specifically some red ochre pigment, some yellow ochre pigment. The body image on the shroud is a straw yellow color. Now, what pigment color resembles that? Yellow ochre. But yellow ochre is hydrated iron oxide. Hematite, red ochre, is dehydrated iron oxide. It's got a different color. One has a reddish cast. It's totally not mistakable with the straw yellow color. So if he was going to say it should have been something, he should have said it was yellow ochre, but he knew that he didn't, from what he was seeing, it wasn't matching with that. So he was saying red ochre. It's not even the right color. I mean, anyway, I've done a comparison with the two pigments. You can clearly tell the difference between the two. But so when they first did the first conference in post-Turin in Santa Barbara, I think it was in 1979, Macron was there, and Heller and Adler and all of them, they were there, and they were, I'm trying to think if Adler, yeah, Adler was already there. And they were asking him, peppering him with some questions about his observations. And he was saying, there is no blood on the shroud. It's iron oxide. It's red ochre paint, blah, 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 blah. And Heller, and it's written in Heller's book, which is called The Report. What is it? I think The Report on the Shroud of Turin. And it's out of print, but you can find it on eBay for about $8 or so, if it's available. I've been telling everybody about it. I tell people, if there's one book you read about the Shroud, it should be Heller's book. And the most important part, and I think Detective Wallace will appreciate this, is that Heller, the person writing the book, is the one that was doing these experiments along with Adler. And so he has first-hand knowledge. That's the gold standard right there, first-hand knowledge. So that's why I love Heller and Adler's writings. They're priceless. Anyway, so they start asking him about this. And at one point, after Macron had the tapes for several months, he was supposed to hand it over to Heller and Adler so they could start their chemical investigations, but he wasn't, and they kept trying to call him, and he didn't respond. So finally, Heller again tried, and Macron just sends like only 4 tapes, and of the 4, there was one that was supposedly a blood tape where Macron circled something like, maybe there's something here. Can't remember if he put a question mark or by it or whatever, but turned out, that wasn't it. Oddly enough, this famous microscopist, the father of modern microscopy, it turned out that it was on when Heller was looking at the so there was a slide with blood, one or supposed to be from a blood area, and a body image tape, and one from a non-image area. And I forget what the 4th one was. but that doesn't matter. But it was from a sample gotten from a non-image area. When Heller starts looking at it with his microscope, and I'm sure it was probably just a polarized light microscope, just like Macron's, he sees 7 reddish particles on a non-image tape that obviously had been looked at by Macron, yet Macron didn't apparently see anything. Otherwise, he would have said something, because obviously he wouldn't want to be one-upped. But Macron didn't spot the 7 particles that Heller spotted, and that later they tested out to be blood through the porphyrins, but and heme derived. But then there was an 8th thing. It was this big old piece that Heller jokingly nicknamed biltong after somewhere in Africa, a tribe in Africa, they will dry meat and they call it biltong. And it was in Heller had been to Africa and seen it. And so when he saw this much larger, comparatively speaking, red particle, he dubbed it biltong. And Macron didn't see any of that. I mean, how do you explain that? I mean, just the sloppiness of his work. I don't know, and there's no reason why he'd want to hide it, because he'd want to be the first to recognize it and to find it and discover it. So it's weird. It is sloppy. I'm sorry. That's just the truth. And we got the evidence for it. And so they, when they asked Macron, well, you're saying there's no blood on here and that this is iron oxide, they started saying, well, did you do any chemical testing? This is all in Heller's book. And he said, no, just, I just used the microscope. And, and then he was puffing himself saying, but I've got experience. Yes, experience, whatever. His experience must not be so great if he messed that up. It's interesting though, too, if you, I'm not a scientist, but, I've gotten into this to where, if I want to know what I need to know, I got to get involved in the science. So, I mean, I've bought a microscope, 2 microscopes, and I've looked at iron oxide. I've looked at red ochre, yellow ochre, vermilion, which he claims is the blood. I've looked at these things under the microscope and compared them to blood. And actually, at certain magnifications, iron oxide and blood are just about indistinguishable. I mean, honestly, I'd say they are pretty indistinguishable at certain magnifications where I've looked at them. Now, maybe an even more trained eye than mine. Mine's not trained, but I mean, I see the pictures and I'm comparing them, and I even ran a little test with with a very big Shroud scholar that she'll go unnamed, but I sent him a photo, and I can't remember if it was blood or iron oxide, but I asked him, but I knew which one it was. I just don't remember right now, but I asked him, well, what do you think this is? And he said the opposite, but the point is that they're indistinguishable. I said, no, you're wrong. It's the other, but that proved my point that at certain magnifications, they look the same. And, but anyway, so Macron, because of that initial mistake by examining the particles through, and he admits this in his papers, in one of his papers, first one, he's looking at it through, or was it his second one? I think it's his first one. He's looking at it through the tape, but he also mentions it in his book. So that's how the screw up happened. But the problem is that once he screwed things up, he didn't fess up and just say, oh gosh, I didn't realize the, mea culpa, didn't realize I should have checked, but I forgot to check to make sure that the sticky tape's not optically active. When Heller and Adler did their examination, they were removing the fibers and the particles from the sticky tape washing them clean with toluene and then examining the particles. And so they didn't have the skewing of a refractive index or the skewing of whether something is birefringent or not, or anisotropic or not. So those are the big problems. And because of that initial mistake,
that does then, right? Because, I remember I was told by a certain skeptic named that was the case and stuff like that. It was actually competent part to not remove it from the sticky tape, and so you're confirming.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
That would be getting erroneous on our conclusion.
Absolutely. Heller and Adler confirmed it, and they write about it in their book. They're like, yeah, if you're looking at the, they checked it out. They're like, yeah, if you're looking at these particles through the tape, it gives you the wrong type of refractive index. It gives you it, and then it appears, like it's behaving like it's iron oxide, but it's not. If you look at it the right way, where it's not getting skewed. So, and then later on, McCrone tried to say that the blood stains were just red ochre, but then he changed that and said it was vermilion. Well, vermilion is mercuric sulfide. And while they were in Turin, in Turin, this isn't just with little bitty fibers off tapes. They put the whole shroud and did, an X-ray fluorescence examination, and with the X-ray radiography, they did certain areas. And if there had been mercuric sulfide, which its opacity is like lead, it would have lit up like a firefly in terms of the images with the X-ray fluorescence and the X-ray radiography. The blood is not touched up with iron oxide or with vermilion. I've actually done some experiments too, where I got some of my own blood and put in little bits of iron oxide, and then done another sample with little bits of vermilion. You can tell where the vermilion and where the iron oxide is, especially the vermilion. You can spot the difference when you put the two together. Now, additionally, and I've done a bunch of research on vermilion, under the conditions that the shroud was under, that vermilion would have most likely blackened, as vermilion is prone to do under certain circumstances. So it's not vermilion. There's no evidence. There was a little bit of vermilion that even Heller and Adler detected in one spot, but that would have been obviously from one of these paintings that had been touched to the shroud for sanctification. Actually, I have some vermilion paint, and if you look at it, and if you even just Google through art history, the perfect paint color for blood is vermilion. And so they're, and I think, I'm sorry.
I'm just curious. So does that mean Giulio Fonte's theory is falsified? Because didn't he say the bloodstains were touched up? I thought it was with vermilion, or did he say they touched it up with red ochre?
He's mostly, I think, done with the red ochre. But as I have had many discussions with Giulio about this, I think I figured out why he was seeing some of the things that he was seeing. Sometimes he was looking at also comparing things that he had seen from shroud dusts that he has in his possession from Giovanni Rigi di Numana, who was one of the Italian scientists that was there with Stirp in 1978. Actually, the Italian scientists and the Swiss botanist Max Fry.
You're saying he's changed his mind, right?
much so
Okay.
from our discussions, and he ended up writing a paper after, I don't know, about 2 years of my badgering. We were having discussions back and forth. He wrote a paper, and he's backed off of that, and with what he's seeing in the dusts, because so Giovanni Ricci gave him some shroud samples, but also some of the dusts where they used that. They vacuumed some dust as they split open the shroud from the backing cloth to put in a vacuum. So like there were some areas where Julio was saying, yeah, but look at all this iron oxide, that he was having through, I can't remember, maybe Raman spectroscopy or something, where he was saying, but look, how do you explain this iron oxide? I'll explain that in a second. But one of the things that I noticed, I said, well, show me a map of where Ricci was vacuuming these dusts from what you're telling me about. So he shows me the map. So I go looking at it. Guess what I find? In the pathway of where that vacuum would have gone, it crosses into the water stains. Now, why does that matter? Why? Because at the perimeters of the water stains, there is iron oxide, but it's not paint pigment. It's iron oxide that ended up becoming iron oxide from, and we need to back up into what's on linen. So when you produce linen, you get a flax plant, you put it in a natural body of water, you let the pectins and stuff from the linen loosen up, and then you pull it out of the water. Well, that's my dog. And you, excuse me a minute, let me see what's wrong with my dog. Hold on a second.
Nah. And while you're I think it'll be good to get so obviously Teddi specialized in researching Walter McCrone, so that's why she's giving a lot of specific details here about Walter McCrone's findings. But it'll be interesting when she comes back. I'll just want to let her finish off her point, but then also finish off. This is a review of what Wallace said, so I'll want to see what she thinks about so Teddi, I was just saying, I want to see, obviously we're reviewing what Wallace said. So I'm also curious to know what was your take about Wallace's understanding or the way he covered the Stirp versus Walter McCrone thing. Do you think, obviously it can't be thorough in a 1 hour show, but do you think he had a good grasp and was justified in the conclusions he came to?
I'm trying to remember the details of what he said about McCrone, but he seemed to, I think that McCrone might be more credible than really what he is. So that was kind of my takeaway of what he was saying. But one of the things that's important to recognize is iron in the shroud. That's a big thing. So as I was mentioning with linen, when you're producing linen with the flax, so when that flax is in the water, it starts getting certain things that are in the water that get covalently bound to it. And iron gets covalently bound to the flax, and there's also strontium and calcium in the water, in these natural waters, that gets bound to the flax. So then they produce it into linen, and one of the things is that the Stirp team found a rather uniform layer of iron, calcium, and strontium all throughout the shroud. Now, in areas where there are blood stains or sometimes some dirt, the calcium levels increase for the dirt, like with limestone. And obviously there's iron in blood, it's in the porphyrins. The iron levels are going to go up where there are blood stains, but when you take away the blood stains, there's a roughly uniform layer of iron. And they found this through this X-ray fluorescence examination. So So is there iron on the shroud? You betcha. And the X-ray fluorescence examination was sensitive enough to where it picked up the presence of iron that is not visible with the naked eye. So we know that the test was sensitive enough. If the test can pick up iron that's invisible, well then obviously if the body image and the blood are done with iron, of course it's going to pick it up, yet it didn't. But now what other iron is on there? Well, there's iron in blood, as we mentioned, that's from heme. And then there is iron oxide on the shroud, but it's not creating the body image. Chemistry professor Alan Adler was the one who talked about how the Beer-Lambert law, and he talked about, people say that this is a painting, but if it's a painting, you've got to account for where there is paint. There has to be the necessity of paint, but also the sufficiency of paint to account for the image that is seen. The iron oxide on the shroud does not account for the image that is seen at all. The iron oxide that we see on the shroud, we know that at least one, but I'm sure many of the copies of the shroud have iron oxide is what they painted the body image with. And we know at least one, the I'm going to butcher this name, Palma de Montechiaro, something like that. That one is confirmed to have iron oxide and vermilion for the blood. So, and that one was touched to the shroud. So contact transfer through Locard's principle of contact transfer there. But then we've got, so with this iron oxide, first of all, we know that there's blood on the shroud. There's an area by the lance wound, the side wound, where there's blood, but also it gets scorched. Now, what happens when blood becomes combusted? Burnt blood turns into iron oxide. How about them apples, as my dad would say? So that's interesting. That can account for some of the blood, especially since the shroud had been rolled up and folded countless times over centuries. We know that there is mechanical abrasion of the top parts of the blood stains where it's flaked off on the upper crowns of the fibers. And so that blood has translocated to different areas of the shroud. Where there was burnt blood, that has translocated in some areas too. Also, though, back to the water stain margins, the perimeters of the water stain margins, those are darker. And that's called the, what do they call it? Like the coffee, something like the coffee spreading effect, something like that. Like if you have a liquid, let's say you have a chair.
Let's try to wrap up. We are approaching the hours.
Okay. But people are going to rely upon this to debunk somebody that is a very well-known apologist that just said the shroud's fake. So, I'd urge us to take the time that we need to educate people, because a lot of people aren't going to stick their nose into hard to read papers. So
How much time do you take?
I don't know. Just let me try to explain just real quick. So we got these water, and it like if you drop a liquid onto a cloth, a lot of the color of the liquid is going to start going to the perimeter. And if you go to wash a stain, if you don't dry it really quickly, it'll leave it's the coffee ring effect. That's what it was called. Well, that's what you have in the water stain margins. The iron that was naturally present in the flax from the retting process, when when the shroud, which was in the reliquary, when the water came in through a breach of the reliquary that melted, it was a silver and wooden reliquary. When the water came in and it created those water stains, or some of the water stains, and scorch marks, that chromatographed was the term that Heller and Adler used, and there was the water has oxygen, it mixes in with the iron, and then you end up getting iron oxide, Fe 2O3. And so that iron, it ended up turning the iron, mixing in with the oxygen of the water, and then it pushed to the edges of the stain. And so there is iron oxide around the edges of the water stain margins. So, but those sources of iron do not account for the image. Okay, thanks for letting me go on long. Appreciate it.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, I think in terms of the Wallace video, that covers all the main points that I had here that he covered in his video. After that, he just gives his conclusions by kind of summarizing, okay, you can make kind of a pro Shroud case. Mostly the images would be the strength of that case. But then on the history end, the Shroud sucks, and the Shroud skeptics have a equally great case, if not a stronger case. And that's where he gives his own take of that 60-40, where we kind of started in the beginning. I'm not sure how to, I guess, just to close off then. I think in light of everything that we've covered, you can clearly see that the pro Shroud side is much stronger than Wallace's evaluation and stuff like that. And go ahead, Teddy.
Oh, I wanted something really important too in terms of a forgery hypothesis, the blood first, image second, because Dr. Kelly Kears has posited that, maybe the blood did something to eat up the body image. Maybe there was body image there first, but the blood ate through the body image stuff. This is in one of Kelly's papers. That doesn't fly. Why not? Because with cellulosic yellowing and with what we see with and by the way, cellulosic yellowing is straw yellow, the color of the body image on the shroud. And what Heller and Adler saw in the body image area is that the fibers were corroded. They were rough compared to the areas of the shroud that didn't have a body image on it. Now, and Giulio Fanti has, in looking at some of his samples that he has, he showed me this. He also talked about, it's not just corrosion. He talked about how there's corrugation, like a rippling effect, like the flax fibers pushed together and creates these ripples. And so you actually have both. Now, I don't know, I cannot attest to whether the literature in cellulosic yellowing says anything about corrugation, but I can tell you from my deep research on cellulosic yellowing that I did, because it was one of my woohoo moments when I came across it, and I saw that it said that with cellulosic yellowing on linen and cotton, it will corrode, the magic word, the fibers. And so, I felt like I hit the lottery when I came across that. But so back to the bloodstains. So the reason why the Stirp team came up with the hypothesis of blood went on the shroud first and then the image was created second, which makes perfect sense. If you have Jesus's body, you wrap him in a shroud, of course, there's going to be bloodstains that get transferred. The image process only came at the time of the resurrection, 3 days later. But now, what about, so Heller and Adler, what they did was they got fibers that had blood on them, shroud fibers from the sticky tapes that had blood on them. They added a protease treatment. And what that does is that eats up the proteins. And of course, blood has proteins in the form of, what is it, globulin and something else. But anyway, it basically digests the protease treatment that they did, digests the blood to remove it. And they were stunned when they saw that underneath the blood, the fiber was like pristine, like in the non-image areas. So that's how they came up with the idea that the blood must have protected the cloth underneath. When the image formation came on top, like where the blood is, it didn't create image where the blood is protecting it, but it did it around it, which makes perfect sense. But Kelly was saying, oh, but what if the blood ate through the body image straw yellow color? And I said, because again, what Heller and Adler said, if there was body image under the blood, then those fibers should have been corroded. But Heller and Adler did not detect corrosion. They said it was pristine, like the non-image areas. So take that.
All right, there we go. So, all right, cool. So, yeah, I think we have breached the 3-hour mark kind of thing. But, yeah, I think it's good to wrap up at this point. Yeah, any final things about the Wallace video in particular that you want to leave off with, or have you said everything?
I do. And my message to Detective Wallace and to others listening, and hopefully he'll listen to this, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for the work that he has done in apologetics and many of the other apologists, including you, Dale, and the work that you've done outside of Shroud Matters. But we know that when we are debating skeptics, and they're getting more and more clever and sophisticated and trickier to deal with, and we know, I mean, let's be straight. We know that there are some issues in the gospel where at least sometimes there is the appearance of an inconsistency. I'm actually doing work right now dealing with the seeming inconsistency between the time of crucifixion, what's in John and Mark. So maybe there's not an inconsistency there, but we know that there's some issues where there's some differences, and the skeptics, like to wield that with a sword and challenge us, and sometimes we're able to get around them, but sometimes our answers are not necessarily as strong as we would like them to be. And so, yes, I think apologetics, I think that there is very strong evidence for Christianity for a number of reasons. But I will tell you, I'll be straight. If I didn't have the Shroud evidence, would I still be a Christian? Yes, I would. Would I believe that the God of Christianity is real beyond a reasonable doubt without the Shroud evidence? No, I wouldn't. And I'd have good reason not to have, as a critically thinking person, to not have that degree of confidence. I'd be confident. I mean, I think there are lots of arguments, intelligent design, lots of reasons to think that the Gospels and the Bible is true, but I wouldn't have confidence beyond a reasonable. That's, like about 97% plus confidence. But the Shroud evidence is so compelling because, and here's another term that Detective Wallace will be very familiar with, it has indicia of reliability through certain things like the evidence of rigor mortis, the evidence of cadaveric spasm. It's the title of my paper, beyond imagination. It's beyond anybody's imagination to add details, especially that are irrelevant to the people that would have been looking at the cloth. And so I think, and again, to use another legal term, respectfully, I believe, kind of like with what Johnny Cochran was saying with the OJ case, don't have a rush to judgment. And I'm certain that Detective Wallace, well, first of all, when you're first starting to learn about the Shroud, you don't know how much there is to know. And so it takes years of diligent study to learn all these things. He didn't put in that sort of time. It doesn't appear that it sounds like he was asked to review it, and he certainly did his homework, but it takes a lot more than that to really start to appreciate all the finer points. And so please, I implore you to examine the things that I've said, perhaps listen to some of these arguments more than once, things that I've mentioned. But there really is. I put my own personal and professional credibility on the line. And, I'm out there and I'm constantly debating issues with skeptics like Hugh Ferry and Dan Porter and some others. And so I know what they're going to argue, and I'm there and I'm constantly fighting back. And they haven't cornered me yet. And I think a lot of times, they get cornered with some of the arguments because you know why? I've got truth on my side. And as Detective Wallace knows, usually when somebody's innocent, there will tend to be evidence that comes up that enables a fierce defense attorney to zealously represent their client and to convince the prosecutors or a jury that the person needs, to have the charges dismissed. I've had so many clients where we, just on the eve of trial or sometimes even the morning of trial, where I show my hand to the prosecutors to show them why they're probably going to lose their case and they don't want to risk it, and they back off. So, please take another look at the evidence, because I tell you this, it is the strongest piece of evidence that we have that the God of Christianity is real. It's not a sign that we're looking for signs. It is a gift from God that has been given to us with God's face, his image, where we can see it, we can bond him. And now with AI, we can really, really get a great idea of what Jesus looked like. This is a gift to us. We weren't demanding it as evidence. It was given to us, and it was given to us primarily as evidence to prove that the falsifiable claim that Jesus made, that he would be killed and rise again. And he gives us the proof, just like he gave people proof by resurrecting people, by performing miracles. And this was the ultimate proof. As Gregory Referendarius says, God's glory. I'll close with that.
All right. So yeah, that's everything for today. And I do hope, obviously, for the fan who let me know, oh, Harry, you're in the audience. Harry, it was you that recommended this to me in terms of Wallace's videos. So yeah, we all have a lot of respect for his work as an apologist and what he's done. And yeah, hopefully this gives you a chance to give a second consideration to it, and maybe you'll change your mind in time. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And just so the audience knows, so the next show I have on the agenda, it's another Shroud Wars show, something that I've been looking forward to organizing for forever now. But I'm finally doing a debate on Shroud history with two Shroud experts. So we have Jack Marquardt representing the image of God incarnate hypothesis. He's going to be facing off against Otangelo Grasso, who's hardcore for the Mandylion theory. Although he has some nuance. I think he separates Mandylion from the image of Edessa. But nonetheless, that's what's coming up on Thursday at 11 a.m. We're going to have an actual debate on Shroud history from two pro-Shroud experts. And then on Friday, Dr. Gary Habermas will be coming on to discuss his 4-volume magnum opus on the resurrection. So tune into that. And there's possibly another show on the horizon with Phil Bear and Juan on the logic of the Trinity. And another show, I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but Cameron Bertuzzi from Capturing Christianity expressed an interest that he wanted to bring me back on his main show to talk about the Shroud of Turin with Bob Rucker and possibly Jeremiah Johnston. So hopefully that goes through. I haven't heard anything back from him yet, but hopefully it'll go through. But if not, like I said, there'll be another time. So yeah, that's my shows for this week. So yeah, take care, everybody, and have a good day. Oh, you were paused there. What did you say?
Oh, bye. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.